There is a clay object inside the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford that should be impossible. It is not especially large. It is not covered in gold. It was not recovered from the tomb of a famous pharaoh, and it does not contain a treasure map leading to a lost city. It is simply a four-sided clay prism. Across its surface, ancient scribes pressed thousands of wedge-shaped marks into wet clay. The writing records the names of cities, the rulers associated with those cities, and the number of years each ruler supposedly remained in power. At first, that may sound like an ordinary royal record. Then you reach the first name, Ululam. According to the tablet, Ululam became king after kingship descended from heaven. He ruled for 800 years, not 28 years, not 288 years, 28,800 years. The next king, Alangar, ruled for 36,000 years. Then came Enmenluana, whose reign lasted 43,290 years. One ruler after another appears on the tablet, each attached to a reign so enormous that a single king would have watched entire civilizations rise and disappear while remaining on the throne. In the best-known surviving version of the Sumerian king list, 8 rulers governed 5 cities for a combined total of 241,200 years. And then the tablet reaches one short sentence. A sentence so brief that it almost disappears beneath the impossible numbers surrounding it. The flood swept over. That is where the first world ends. After the flood, kingship descends again. New rulers appear. But something has changed. The first post-flood king is no longer credited with tens of thousands of years. His reign is listed as 1,008 years. Still impossible by modern standards, but dramatically shorter than what came before. The rulers who follow receive 990 years, 690 years, 4020 years, 300 years. The numbers continue falling. Thousands become hundreds. Hundreds become decades. Eventually, the list reaches kings whose reigns resemble normal human history. The transition is unmistakable. Before the flood, time is almost unlimited. After the flood, it begins collapsing. The Ashmolean dates its famous Weld-Blundell prism to approximately 1800 BC and identifies it as the most extensive surviving version of the Sumerian king list. Oxford's translation preserves the list's extraordinary pre-flood reigns, its total of 241,200 years, and the abrupt statement that the flood swept over. For generations, historians have offered a straightforward explanation. The early kings are mythological. The numbers are symbolic. The tablet was never intended to describe literal human lifespans, and that may be correct. But it does not solve the entire mystery, because the numbers are not random. They follow a mathematical structure. The kings are placed in a deliberate sequence. The flood creates a clear boundary. And after that boundary, the enormous reigns do not simply disappear at once. They decline in stages. It is almost as though the tablet is preserving the memory of a gradual collapse. A collapse in human longevity. A collapse in political authority. A collapse in knowledge. Or perhaps a collapse in the way humanity experienced time itself. Tonight, we are going to investigate what the Sumerian king list actually says, what it does not say, and why its impossible numbers have resisted every simple explanation offered for them. We will examine the 8 rulers who supposedly governed before the flood. We will test the theory that their years were really months. We will look at the base 60 mathematics hidden inside their reigns. We will compare the world before the flood with the world that came after it. And finally, we will ask the question at the center of the tablet. What happened? What could make a civilization remember an earlier age in which rulers remained alive for tens of thousands of years, only for those lifespans to shrink after one catastrophic event? Was it mythology? Was it political propaganda? Was it a mathematical code? Was an entire dynasty represented as one king? Or was the list preserving a distorted memory of a real change in the human condition? Because the tablet does not merely say that people once lived longer. It records the moment when that age ended. Before we continue, subscribe if you are interested in the ancient documents that become stranger the more carefully they are examined. This channel does not begin with the assumption that every ancient story is literal, but it also does not assume that every impossible detail is meaningless. We look at the evidence. We separate the inscription from the interpretation, and we follow the mystery wherever the surviving record leads. Because the real secret of this tablet may not be that one king lived for 30,000 years. The real secret may be that the people who wrote his name believed human history had once operated according to an entirely different measure of time, and they believed they knew exactly when it changed. Chapter 1. The tablet that divided human history in two. The object is known today as the Weld-Blundell prism. It was probably produced in the ancient city of Larsa, in what is now Iraq, during the early 2nd millennium BC. The prism is made of clay. Each of its 4 sides contains 2 columns of cuneiform writing, giving the object the appearance of a compact archive designed to be turned and read from every direction. It is one of several surviving versions of what modern scholars call the Sumerian king list. That name can be slightly misleading. The text is not simply a clean government record. It is not an ancient equivalent of a modern database listing confirmed rulers in perfect chronological order. It is something more complex, part history, part theology, part political argument, part memory of a world the scribes themselves already regarded as unimaginably ancient. The text begins not with a battle, a coronation, or the founding of a kingdom. It begins with power arriving from somewhere else. Kingship descended from heaven. Then kingship was established in Eridu. That sentence defines the entire world of the list. Kingship is not portrayed as a human invention. It is not something created because one ambitious individual gathered soldiers and declared himself ruler. It is presented as an institution that came down from the divine realm, a power placed on earth, a system entrusted to a city. And that system could move. Eridu possesses kingship. Then Eridu falls. Kingship moves to Bad Tabira. Bad Tabira eventually falls. Kingship moves again. The cities change. The rulers change. But kingship itself survives. It behaves almost like an object, something transferred from one location to another, something no city owns permanently, something granted and then withdrawn. This is one reason the list was politically valuable. By arranging Mesopotamian history as a single succession of cities, the text suggests that only one city at a time could possess legitimate authority over the land. That was not necessarily how ancient Mesopotamian politics actually worked. Different cities frequently existed at the same time. Their kings could rule simultaneously. They formed alliances, fought wars, controlled neighboring territories, and claimed overlapping authority. But the king list compresses the complicated political reality into a single line of succession. One city falls. Another receives kingship. One dynasty ends. Another takes its place. The Ashmolean Museum explains that the list appears to have promoted the idea that legitimate dominion, determined by the gods, could belong to only one city at any given time. By ending with the rulers of Izan, the composition helped present that dynasty as the rightful successor to the great powers of the past. In other words, the list was not politically neutral. It had an agenda, but propaganda can still preserve old material. A king may use an ancient tradition to justify his authority without inventing every part of that tradition. The important question is therefore not whether the list had a political purpose. It clearly did. The question is why the people shaping that political argument chose to begin with kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years. If the scribes merely wanted to legitimize a current dynasty, they could have invented a simple chain of respectable ancestors. Instead, they constructed or inherited a chronology so enormous that it moves beyond normal history, and they placed a flood directly in the middle of it. The list is divided into 2 worlds, the world before the flood and the world after it. Before the flood, the rulers are associated with 5 cities: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larag, Zimbir, Shurupag. These were not meaningless locations to the scribes. Eridu in particular carried enormous religious importance. It was associated with the god Enki, a deity connected with wisdom, fresh water, craftsmanship, and the foundations of civilization. In later Mesopotamian thought, Eridu was remembered as one of the oldest cities in existence. So when the king list begins there, it does not merely select the first city in a geographical sequence. It begins at the sacred beginning, the place where ordered civilization first entered the human world. Then the tablet names 2 kings, Alulim, Alangar. Together, they rule for 800 years. Eridu falls. Kingship moves to Bad Tabira. 3 more rulers appear. Their combined reigns last 108,000 years. Kingship then moves through Larag and Zimbir before reaching Shurupag. There, the final pre-flood king rules. Ubaratutu, 18,600 years. Then the flood sweeps over. The entire pre-flood world disappears in one line. No battle is described. No royal family escapes. No army marches from one city to another. The text does not explain how high the water rose or how many people died. It simply closes the first age. Then kingship descends from heaven again. That second descent is critical. It suggests a restoration. The system that existed before the flood is reintroduced after the catastrophe. But the restored world is not identical to the first. Its rulers are diminished. Its cities are different. Its timescale is smaller. It is as though kingship returns, but not everything that once accompanied it returns with it. Perhaps that is why the list remains so disturbing. The flood does not merely separate two groups of kings. It separates two conditions of existence. Before it, royal time is vast. After it, time contracts. Before it, the kings seem closer to the divine world from which kingship descended. After it, kingship remains divine, but its holders become increasingly human. And by the time the list approaches rulers who can be confirmed through other inscriptions, the impossible numbers have largely vanished. The text slowly moves out of sacred time and into historical time. That creates a problem. If every early ruler were pure fantasy, why does the list transition gradually toward verifiable history? Why not separate myth and history cleanly? Why allow them to flow into each other? The answer may be that the ancient scribes did not recognize the boundary we now impose. To them, the earliest age was not necessarily fictional. It was remote, sacred, distorted by time, but still part of the same continuous story. The kings of the historical world were not replacing mythical characters. They were inheriting the same kingship that had once belonged to Ululim. The list does not restart after the impossible reigns. It continues. That continuity is the mechanism of the text's power. The ruler who commissioned or supported the list could claim that his authority came through an unbroken chain reaching back beyond the flood, beyond ordinary human memory, and ultimately back to heaven. But that continuity also preserves the mystery. Because once the scribes connected their real kings to the impossible kings, they invited a question they could not control. What exactly did they believe those first rulers were? Were they humans? Were they gods? Were they demigods? Were they symbols for dynasties? Or were the scribes working with an inherited tradition so old that even they no longer understood the numbers they were copying? There are multiple surviving versions of the king list, and they do not agree perfectly. Some omit rulers. Some arrange sections differently. Some give different regnal lengths. The antediluvian section itself is not present in every copy. That matters because it tells us this was a living textual tradition, edited and reshaped by scribes rather than copied mechanically without change. But variation does not erase the central structure. In the best-known version, kingship descends. 8 kings rule. The flood comes. Kingship descends again. That is too deliberate to be dismissed as a copying accident. Something about the flood was necessary to the design of the story. It explained why the world of the earliest rulers no longer existed. It created distance between divine kingship and ordinary kingship. And perhaps most importantly, it explained why no one living in the scribe's own time could expect to rule for 30,000 years. The impossible age belonged to the lost world. It could not be tested. It could not be visited. Its cities had fallen. Its rulers were gone. The flood had erased the evidence, except for their names, except for their reigns, except for the numbers pressed into clay. And once those numbers are placed beside one another, they begin to reveal a pattern that leads to 8 kings, 5 cities, and more than 200,000 years of missing time. Chapter 2, 8 kings and 200 years. The first name is Ululim. The king list places him in Eridu. According to the text, he rules for 800 years. There is no detailed biography, no account of his childhood, no description of his palace, no list of wars. The tablet simply gives the city, the name, and the number. That absence creates its own power. Ululim is not presented like a character in an epic. He is presented like an entry in an archive. The format makes the impossible number feel administrative, routine, almost unquestioned. Ululim does not perform a miraculous act to earn his enormous reign. The scribe records 800 years, as though this were simply how long the first king ruled. Then comes Alangar. 36,000 years. Together, the two kings of Eridu account for 64,800 years. Consider what that number means if taken literally. The entire span of recorded human civilization would fit inside their combined reigns many times over. Languages would form and disappear. Coastlines would shift. Climates would change. Generations beyond counting would be born, grow old, and die, while the same rulers remain connected to the throne. It is biologically impossible according to everything currently known about human life. And yet the list has only begun. Eridu falls. The wording is abrupt. The tablet does not tell us whether the city was invaded, abandoned, flooded, or politically replaced. It simply says kingship was taken to Bad Tibera. There En-men-lu-ana becomes king. His reign is the longest in the best-known pre-flood sequence, 43,200 years. The number is not arbitrary. It is exactly 12 units of 600. That structure will become important. After him comes En-men-gal-ana, 28,800 years. Then Dumuzid the shepherd, 36,000 years. Dumuzid is different from many of the names surrounding him because he appears elsewhere in Mesopotamian religion and literature. Later tradition remembers Dumuzi as a divine or semi-divine figure, associated with shepherding, fertility, seasonal death, and the goddess Inanna. That does not prove the king on the list was a god walking physically on earth, but it reinforces the sense that the pre-flood rulers occupy a boundary between kingship and divinity. They do not belong completely to the ordinary historical world. The three rulers of Bad Tibera govern for a combined total of 8,000 years. Then Bad Tibera falls. Kingship moves to Larag. There, Insipid-Zid-Ana rules for 28,800 years. One king, one city, nearly 30 millennia. Then Larag falls. Kingship moves to Zimbir, often identified with Sipar. En-men-dur-ana becomes king. His reign lasts 200,000 years. Dordian-Mandur-Forna would later become associated with traditions of divine instruction and heavenly knowledge. Some Mesopotamian material connects him with the sun god and with the transmission of specialized wisdom. Again, that does not make him a confirmed historical person, but it shows how the identities of pre-flood rulers became entangled with the idea that knowledge itself had descended from the divine world. These kings were not remembered merely as political administrators. They belonged to the age when heaven and earth were closer. Then Zimbir falls. Kingship reaches Shuruppak. The final ruler is Ubaratutu. He rules for 18,600 years. His position is important because Shuruppak is closely connected with Mesopotamian flood traditions. In the Sumerian instructions of Shuruppak, Ubaratutu is identified as the father of Shuruppak, who in turn addresses Ziusudra, the flood survivor in the Sumerian tradition. The surviving literary traditions, therefore, place the final pre-flood kingship and the flood hero within the same network of names and locations. Ubaratutu's reign ends. Then the flood sweeps over. The Oxford translation summarizes the pre-flood section with precise finality: 5 cities, 8 kings, and 200 years. That number is so enormous that it almost prevents serious investigation. Once people hear 2,000 years, they tend to choose one of two reactions. Some accept the number literally and immediately construct theories of immortal rulers, extraterrestrial kings, or forgotten superhuman species. Others laugh, label the entire section mythology, and stop looking. Both reactions are understandable. Neither is sufficient. Literal acceptance ignores the lack of biological and archaeological evidence. Complete dismissal ignores the mathematical precision of the text. The list is not saying that the kings ruled for a very long time. It does not use vague language like countless generations or an age beyond memory. It provides exact totals: 28,800, 36,000, 43,200, 21,000, probably scranned, 18,600. These values have structure. Most are built from large units within Mesopotamia's sexagesimal or base 60 mathematical tradition. A unit known as a sar represented 3,600. The first king's 28,800-year reign equals 8 sars. Alangar's 36,000 years equal 10. En-men-lu-ana's 43,200 equal 12. The pattern is mathematical before it is biological. Or perhaps mathematical instead of biological. That raises a possibility. Maybe the list was never claiming that these rulers possessed bodies capable of surviving for 30,000 solar years. Perhaps each king represents something else. A dynasty, a celestial period, a cycle, an institution, a priestly lineage, a symbolic number chosen to indicate closeness to divine perfection. But if that is true, why use kings' names at all? Why not simply record the cycles? Why place them in cities? Why describe kingship moving from one city to another? And why does the mathematical scale change after the flood? One explanation is that the scribes inherited separate traditions and combined them. The early section may have originated as a mythological list of primordial rulers. The later section may have developed from historical and administrative records. A later editor could have connected the two through the flood. This would explain why the composition feels as though it moves from cosmic mythology into political history. But it still leaves the central choice unexplained. Why was the decline in the numbers necessary? The post-flood kings are not immediately normal. They remain impossibly long-lived. The first ruler after the flood governs for 2,000 years. Others rule for 900, 800, 900, 890, or 4020. This is no sudden correction from myth to fact. It is a descent. The numbers step downward. The divine scale weakens. Human time slowly takes control. That gradual narrowing is one of the strongest reasons the king list continues to inspire theories. It looks less like a simple division between fiction and history and more like a record of transformation. First, rulers govern for tens of thousands of years, then thousands, then hundreds, eventually decades. Imagine the list not as a straight line, but as a funnel. At the wide opening stands Alulim with 28,800 years. At the narrow end stand historical kings, ruling for periods a modern historian would recognize. The flood sits near the beginning of the narrowing. It does not instantly create normal mortality. It begins the process. That is precisely the pattern found in later stories of declining longevity. The earliest figures stand close to creation or divine order. They possess extraordinary lifespans. A catastrophe or moral rupture occurs. Future generations become progressively shorter-lived. The details vary, but the basic structure remains recognizable. Ancient cultures did not always imagine the past as primitive. Often, they imagined it as greater. The earliest people were stronger. The first kings were wiser. The original civilization was closer to the gods. The first age possessed knowledge, later generations lost. History was not always understood as progress. It could be understood as deterioration, a slow movement away from an original condition. The king list may be one of the clearest expressions of that worldview. Its first kings are not cavemen struggling toward civilization. Kingship already exists. Cities already exist. Order has already descended. The earliest world is not incomplete. It is vast. Then something breaks. The flood ends the first age, but it may not be the only cause of the decline. It may be the marker separating two cosmic conditions. Before the flood, the kings operate within divine time. After the flood, they operate within a world increasingly governed by mortality. And that leads to the question every interpretation must answer. What kind of time was the tablet measuring? Because if its years were not our years, the mystery may have a mathematical solution. But when the numbers are converted, reduced, and tested, something unexpected happens. They become smaller. They do not necessarily become normal. Chapter 3. Were the Sumerians measuring time differently? The simplest explanation is also the first one most people think of. Perhaps the word translated as year did not mean a solar year. Maybe the ancient scribes were counting months. If Alulim's 28,800 years were actually lunar months, dividing by 12 would produce approximately 2,400 solar years. That is far shorter than 28,800. It is also still impossible for one human reign. Alangar's 36,000 months would become roughly 3,000 years. Enmenlu Anna's 43 countered 2,000 months would become approximately 3 countered 600 years. The lunar theory reduces the scale. It does not solve the biological problem. What if they counted seasons? Suppose 4 seasonal units were later mistranslated as years. Alulim's reign would still last 722 years. What if they counted days? 28,800 days is approximately 79 solar years. That produces a plausible human lifespan. At first, this appears promising. Alangar's 36,000 days would equal approximately 99 years. Enmin Luana's 43,200 days would equal around 1118 years. Those are long lives, but not absolutely impossible. Could the entire mystery be a simple translation error? Not easily. The problem is that the same mathematical units appear within a developed Mesopotamian system of large numbers. The reigns are built around values such as 3,660 barport. The numeral 3600 was a recognized large number unit, and Mesopotamian mathematics developed within a sexagesimal structure inherited from Sumerian practice. If a scribe wrote 8 units of 1300, the result is not automatically 8 groups of 1300 days. The interpretation depends on the context and on how the text conceptualized a reign. Modern translations render the totals as years because the composition presents them as regnal durations. Changing every unit into days may rescue the biology, but it risks rewriting the text to produce the answer we prefer. And there is another problem. The day conversion does not work evenly across the entire king list. Some later reigns become far too short if treated as days. Once the list reaches historically plausible rulers, its regnal numbers behave like ordinary years. That means the unit would have to change somewhere inside the text. Perhaps it did. Perhaps the pre-flood section used sacred counting, while the historical section used calendar years. But if two systems were combined, where does one end and the other begin? At the flood? During the first dynasty of Kish? At the first historically attested ruler? No surviving line announces that the scribes have changed units. The tablet never says, from this point onward, count differently. The numbers simply shrink. Another explanation is that each king represents an entire dynasty. Alulai may not have been one biological individual. His name may have stood for a royal house, priestly office, or succession of rulers whose combined reign lasted many centuries. Ancient records sometimes compress groups into individuals. A founder can become the symbolic identity of everyone who followed him. If the early kings represent dynasties, the extreme totals become less impossible. But 2,800 years remains an enormous period for a single ruling house. No known political dynasty has maintained uninterrupted control for anything close to that length of time. And if the numbers are dynastic, we must still explain why the dynasty totals are arranged in multiples of 3,000. A third interpretation is astronomical. The reigns may encode celestial cycles. Ancient kingship was closely connected with cosmic order. A king did not merely manage taxation and warfare. He maintained balance between the divine world, the city, and the land. If each primordial ruler corresponded to an astronomical period, the king's name could personify a cycle rather than describe an individual lifespan. In that reading, the list is not saying Alulim's body survived 2,800 years. It is saying the cosmic or political order represented by Alulim governed for 8 units of 3,600. The possibility fits the mathematics. It also fits the sacred character of the pre-flood age. But it lacks a confirmed key. We do not possess a surviving Sumerian note explaining that Alulim represented a particular planet, constellation, or precessional period. Without that key, astronomical interpretations remain hypotheses. They can be elegant. They can reveal patterns. But they cannot be treated as proven translations. A fourth explanation is sacred numerology. The numbers were chosen not to measure chronology, but to express importance. The earliest kings were closest to the divine origin of kingship. Therefore, they received the largest reigns. As history moved farther from the beginning, the reigns became smaller. The numerical decline would then be theological rather than biological. Long life signals divine favor. Short life signals distance from the original order. This is one of the most credible explanations. Ancient texts regularly use numbers symbolically. A number can communicate completion, perfection, power, or cosmic scale without functioning like a modern calendar entry. But even symbolic numbers communicate something. If the scribes used enormous reigns to express closeness to the gods, then the shrinking numbers still preserve a concept of decline. The early world possessed more of something. More authority. Problems. More sacred power. More continuity. More life. After the flood, that quality diminished. The debate is therefore not simply between literal and fictional. A symbolic list can preserve a real ancient belief. The kings may not have physically lived for tens of thousands of years, while the text may still be telling us that the nature of human existence changed after the flood. There is also the possibility of scribal magnification. The farther back the compilers looked, the fewer reliable records they possessed. When memory becomes uncertain, numbers expand. A king from 50 years ago may have a documented reign. A king from 500 years ago becomes legendary. A ruler from the beginning of time becomes almost immortal. The process is familiar. Generations exaggerate the strength of founders, the size of ancient armies, and the length of heroic lives. The earliest kings become larger because they are farther away. This could explain the general trend. But once again, the precision creates resistance. The list does not simply say Alulim reigned for ages. It assigns a mathematically ordered duration. The totals are calculated. The city reigns are summed. The pre-flood age is given a combined value. That looks like deliberate composition, not uncontrolled folklore. Someone chose these numbers. Someone organized them. Someone added them together. And someone considered the final total important enough to preserve. This means the puzzle may not be solved by asking whether the reigns are literal. The more useful question may be, what did the numbers accomplish? They expanded the beginning of kingship beyond ordinary history. They established an age in which rulers were incomparable to later humans. They allowed the civilization's political system to claim an origin older than any living memory. They placed the authority of kingship in a cosmic timescale. And then they used the flood to close that timescale. The sequence creates a psychological effect. Before the flood, the numbers are too large to imagine. After the flood, they remain extraordinary but become increasingly comprehensible. By the time the list reaches its latest dynasties, the reigns have narrowed to normal political time. The reader travels from eternity into history, from gods toward humans, from the beginning toward the present. That may be the true architecture of the document. But there is one final mathematical experiment that makes the mystery even more interesting. Suppose we do not change the unit. Suppose the numbers are intentionally enormous. Then the decline itself becomes the message. En-men-lu-ana rules for 43,200 years. Ubaratutu, the last king before the flood, rules for 18,600. The final pre-flood reign is already less than half the longest. After the flood, the first ruler receives 1,200 years. The fall is immediate and dramatic. Prophetic arc from 18,600 to 2000. More than 90% of the royal timescale disappears across the flood boundary. Then the post-flood numbers continue descending. This is not merely a list of long-lived kings. It is a numerical story of compression. Time itself appears to be closing around humanity. The world begins with rulers who belong to tens of millennia. It ends with rulers who belong to decades. And the flood is positioned at the sharpest point of collapse. That pattern would later appear in another famous ancient tradition. Before the flood, patriarchs lived for centuries. After the flood, their reported ages gradually decrease. Scholars have long compared the genealogical framework of Genesis with Mesopotamian king lists and flood traditions, though the texts differ significantly in theology, scale, and purpose. This does not prove that either tradition records literal prehistoric lifespans. It does prove that the idea of declining longevity after a flood had deep roots in the ancient Near Eastern imagination. The people preserving these traditions believed catastrophe did more than destroy cities. It divided human existence into before and after. And if the king list was designed as political ideology, the flood was still necessary to explain why the first kings were unlike every king who followed them. The flood explains the break, but it does not yet explain the mechanism. Did the gods change humanity? Did the environment become harsher? Was sacred knowledge lost? Or did the scribes transform cosmic cycles into human reigns? To move closer to an answer, we need to watch what happens immediately after the water recedes, because kingship returns, but the world it returns to is smaller. Chapter 4. The moment human time became shorter. The transition occupies only a few words. The flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, kingship descended from heaven. Kingship was established in Kish. At first glance, the sequence appears reassuring. Civilization has survived. Political order has returned. The divine institution of kingship has not been permanently destroyed. The first age is gone, but the structure continues. Then the first new king appears, Gusher. He rules for 200 years. In any modern historical record, 2,000 years would be absurd. Here, it feels almost brief. That is the power of comparison. After reading about 800 years, 2,000 appears diminished. The post-flood world remains extraordinary, but it has lost the vastness of the First Age. The next king, Kalasanabel, is credited in different manuscripts with 900 years. Then comes Nungishlishma, whose reign is preserved in one version as approximately 640 years. And Terra Anna receives 20 years, followed by a damaged and unusually precise edition involving months and days in one manuscript. Babum receives 300 years. Planum is assigned either 800, or 209 years depending on the version. The manuscripts vary, but the central movement remains. The post-flood figures occupy hundreds or low thousands, not tens of thousands. Oxford's translation records the first post-flood dynasty at Kish, with reigns such as 1200, 9060, 600, 9060, 6420, and 300 years, while also showing that different manuscripts sometimes preserve different values. The world has not become fully historical, but it has become more human. That phrase is important. More human does not necessarily mean literally biological. It may mean politically realistic. The pre-flood kings exist in sacred geography. The post-flood kings begin interacting with the world of heroic literature, rival cities, and eventually rulers known through independent inscriptions. As the list progresses, the figures approach recognizable chronology. The Ashmolean notes that the reign lengths become more realistic as the composition reaches historical rulers. That movement suggests the list's compilers were aware of different degrees of historical distance. The beginning was not recorded in the same way as the recent past. It could not have been. The scribes writing around 1800 BC did not possess administrative archives extending back 200 years. No continuous palace bureaucracy had preserved annual tax records from Alulim's first year to Ubaratutu's final year. The pre-flood chronology belonged to inherited tradition. The later chronology could draw increasingly upon king lists, year names, inscriptions, and living political memory. As evidence improved, the reigns became normal. That is the conventional explanation. It is persuasive. But the ancient narrative may still be expressing something deeper than the availability of records. The tablet could have simply begun history, where reliable information started. Instead, it refused to leave the unknown period blank. It populated the beginning with enormous rulers. That choice tells us how the scribes imagined the distant past. They did not imagine it as empty. They imagined it as greater. This is almost the reverse of the modern evolutionary story. We tend to place simplicity at the beginning. Small settlements, limited technology, shorter life expectancy, gradual improvement. The king list places a complete institution at the beginning. Kingship arrives from heaven fully formed. Cities are already present. The first rulers possess durations no later king can approach. History does not climb upward. It descends. The movement is from cosmic scale to human scale, from continuity to fragmentation, from the sacred beginning to ordinary politics. The flood is not simply destruction. It is reduction. That reduction can be read in several ways. The first is political. The early kings receive impossible reigns because they symbolize ideal authority. Later rulers are weaker because real political power is unstable. Cities rise and fall. Dynasties become shorter. Human rulers cannot maintain the order that belonged to the beginning. The second is theological. The earliest world stands closer to the gods. Divine presence supports longevity. After the flood, the relationship changes. The gods remain, but direct proximity is reduced. Human life becomes shorter because humanity has moved farther from the source of life. The third is cultural. The flood destroys knowledge. Survivors preserve fragments, but not the full system. Medicine, agriculture, architecture, ritual, and astronomy continue in reduced form. The shortening of reigns symbolizes the shortening of memory. The fourth is environmental. The world before the flood may have been imagined as physically different. A gentler climate, greater abundance, fewer diseases, different food, different atmospheric or ecological conditions. After catastrophe, survival becomes harder. Lifespans decline. The fifth is mathematical. The list shifts from sacred units to ordinary regnal years. Flood marks not biological change, but a change in chronology. The first section measures cosmic time. The second begins measuring historical time. Each explanation captures part of the pattern. None explains every detail. Political ideology explains why a current dynasty would connect itself to ancient kingship. Sacred numerology explains the enormous values. Historical distance explains why recent reigns are more accurate. Flood mythology explains the sharp division. But the entire composition still produces the same message. Something was lost. The loss is not hidden. It is built into the numbers. Imagine an ancient listener hearing the list recited aloud. They would hear the first kings 28,800 years, then 36,000, then 43,200. The numbers would create a world almost beyond comprehension. Then the flood, then 1,200, then 960, then hundreds. The decline would be audible. The audience would feel history becoming smaller. They would understand that they lived in a reduced age. That idea may have shaped how ancient people understood mortality. Death was not necessarily viewed as an unchanging biological fact that had always operated in exactly the same way. It could be interpreted as the consequence of separation. Humans died because they no longer possessed what the earliest beings possessed. The lost element might be divine food, a plant, a substance, a ritual, a relationship with the gods, a place from which humanity had been expelled, or knowledge that had once allowed certain figures to cross the boundary between human and divine. Mesopotamian literature repeatedly returns to the impossibility of ordinary humans obtaining permanent life. Gilgamesh searches for it. A flood survivor receives it. A plant associated with renewed youth is discovered and then lost. The gods possess a condition that humans desire but cannot keep. That wider tradition makes the king list's lifespan decline more meaningful. The enormous reigns belong to rulers close to the beginning. The flood survivor may receive life like a god. Later heroes can search for immortality, but they cannot secure it for humanity. The door is not described as non-existent. It is closed. That distinction changes the story. If immortality were impossible in every condition, there would be nothing to lose. But Mesopotamian stories often portray extended or divine life as real within the mythological world, while emphasizing that ordinary humans are excluded from it. The Sumerian flood story says the gods granted Ziusudra life like a god and settled him in Dilmun after he preserved humanity and animals. One man survives the boundary. One man crosses into the condition associated with the earlier world. Everyone else inherits mortality. That may be why the flood sits at the center of so many ancient questions about human life. It is not only the event that destroys. It is the event after which the rules change. Before it, kings rule for tens of thousands of years. After it, the longest lives belong to exceptional survivors, ancestors, and heroes. Later, humanity receives work, childbirth, disease, aging, and death. The world continues. But it continues under limits. And those limits become even more explicit when we examine the flood traditions themselves. Because in the fullest Mesopotamian account, the gods are not surprised by the catastrophe. The flood is not a random natural disaster. It is a decision. Chapter 5. The flood was not just water. There are several Mesopotamian flood traditions. They overlap, but they are not identical. The Sumerian flood story centers on Ziusudra. The Akkadian Atrahasis epic presents another version. The Epic of Gilgamesh later incorporates the flood narrative through Utnapishtim. Different languages, different manuscript histories, different theological details, but a recognizable sequence remains. Humanity faces destruction. One individual receives a warning. A vessel is constructed. Life is preserved. The flood destroys the old population. The survivor emerges into a changed world. The British Museum holds old Babylonian tablets containing the Atrahasis story, including material dated to the 17th century BC, as well as the famous later flood tablet from the Epic of Gilgamesh. In modern retellings, the flood is often reduced to a question of water. Did a massive flood physically happen? Was it local or global? Could a particular archaeological layer correspond to it? Did sea level rise preserve memories of drowned settlements? Those are legitimate questions, but they can obscure what the ancient story was trying to explain. Atrahasis is not merely a weather report. It is a story about the management of humanity. In the epic, humans are created within a divine labor crisis. The lesser gods have been performing exhausting work. They dig, they maintain the land, they carry burdens. Eventually, they rebel. Human beings are created to take over that labor. From the beginning, humanity exists inside a system. People work. They reproduce. Their population increases. Then the problem changes. Humanity becomes too numerous and disruptive. The god Enlil becomes disturbed by their noise. Attempts are made to reduce them. Disease, drought, famine. Each crisis is intended to suppress the population. Each time, humanity survives through the intervention and advice of Enki, called E in the Akkadian tradition. Finally, the gods decide upon the flood. The catastrophe is therefore not presented as meaningless nature. It is population control, a deliberate reset that changes how we should read the king list. The flood is positioned immediately after 2,000 years of pre-flood kingship. In the wider Mesopotamian mythological world, the flood also marks a divine attempt to reduce humanity. What follows is not simply reconstruction. It is regulation. The post-flood world requires new limits. The Atrahasis tradition addresses mortality, fertility, and population after the catastrophe. Humanity is permitted to continue, but not without restrictions. The exact surviving text is fragmentary in places, and translations require caution. But the narrative logic is clear. The gods will not allow the same uncontrolled expansion to repeat. The flood cannot become the only solution every time humanity multiplies. So permanent social and biological constraints become part of the world. Mortality is no longer merely something individuals experience. It becomes part of the system that keeps humanity within limits. Now place that beside the king list. Before the flood, 8 rulers received 2,000 years. After the flood, royal time collapses. Could the two traditions preserve versions of the same ancient idea? Not that water chemically shortened human chromosomes. Not that the tablet provides a scientific description of a genetic modification, but that the flood represents a transition from an unrestricted age into a regulated one. Before the flood, divine kingship exists on an enormous scale. After the flood, humans remain under stricter conditions. The world is repopulated, but mortality becomes central. This is where the title of our investigation must be examined carefully. The Sumerian king list does not explicitly say that every ordinary human once lived for 30,000 years. It records kings whose reigns reach tens of thousands of years. A reign is not automatically a lifespan. A ruler could theoretically inherit office before the recorded period, share power, represent a dynasty, or function as a symbolic figure. The claim that humans lived for 30,000 years is therefore an interpretation of the list, not a literal sentence translated from the tablet. But the distinction does not remove the mystery. It sharpens it. Why were the earliest rulers given those reigns? Why does the flood separate them from later kings? Why does Mesopotamian mythology repeatedly connect the flood with new limits on humanity? And why is exceptional longevity reserved for figures connected with the world before the catastrophe? Susudra survives and receives life like a god. Utnapishtim survives and is placed at a distance from ordinary humanity. Gilgamesh later seeks him because the flood survivor possesses what normal kings do not: knowledge of how death was crossed. The flood survivor is therefore more than the last man of the old world. He is a living bridge between two biological and theological conditions. On one side stand the antediluvian kings. On the other stands mortal humanity. He alone remembers both. That is why the flood stories feel less like accounts of a storm and more like explanations for the human condition. Why do we work? Why do we suffer? Why do populations face famine and disease? Why do the gods possess life while humans die? Why was the world once different? The flood becomes the answer. Before it, the relationship between humans, gods, and kingship operated one way. After it, the relationship was renegotiated. Perhaps the decline in lifespan was one part of that renegotiation. The first possibility is theological. The gods deliberately limited human life. Mortality prevented individuals from accumulating power forever. Short lives ensured generational turnover. Disease, infertility, and social restrictions prevented population from again becoming unmanageable. In this interpretation, lifespan did not collapse because humanity became naturally weaker. It was reduced because endless or extreme longevity created a problem for the divine order. That is the darkest solution. It suggests death is not merely a natural feature of human biology within the story. It is governance, a boundary imposed from above. The second possibility is environmental. The flood represents a real catastrophe remembered through mythology. A major inundation could destroy cities, irrigation networks, stored food, medicinal traditions, and stable communities. Survivors living through malnutrition, contaminated water, disease, and social collapse would have far lower life expectancy than people living within an earlier period of abundance. Over generations, the memory of declining health could become magnified. Ancestors who lived longer became heroes who lived for centuries. Primordial kings became beings who ruled for millennia. The biological decline may have been real, while the scale of the reigns became symbolic. The third possibility is institutional. Before the flood, each king's name may represent a lineage or extended system of rule. After the catastrophe, political structures fragmented. Dynasties became shorter. Records became more precise. The collapse of lifespan would therefore be a collapse in the duration of institutions rather than bodies. A king who ruled 36,000 years might symbolize an entire age of kingship associated with one name. When that system ended, rulers began to be recorded as individuals. The fourth possibility is chronological. The pre-flood list uses sacred mathematical units. The post-flood list gradually shifts toward ordinary annual chronology. The flood does not alter humans. It alters the scale of the story. Cosmic time ends. Historical time begins. This explanation is especially attractive because of the structured multiples of 60 and 3/600. But it raises another question. Why would the scribes use the flood as the boundary between cosmic and historical time? Because even if the change is mathematical, the flood still represents a break in reality. The fifth possibility is that multiple explanations were combined. The numbers were symbolic. The flood reflected memories of real disasters. The list served political propaganda. The reigns represented sacred chronology. The decline communicated theological distance from the gods. Ancient texts do not have to fit into one modern category. A composition can be political, religious, mathematical, and historical at the same time. The scribes were not writing for archaeologists 4,000 years later. They were writing for people who already understood the cultural meaning of kingship, flood, divine order, and enormous numbers. We are reading the surviving surface without possessing every assumption beneath it. That is why certainty is dangerous. The literalist may see proof that immortal beings ruled Earth. The skeptic may see nothing but fiction. The tablet itself sits between them. It does not explain its numbers. It preserves them. It does not say ordinary humans were immortal. It places impossible kings at the beginning. It does not describe the biological mechanism of decline. It places a flood exactly where the numerical collapse begins. And the larger mythological tradition describes that same catastrophe as an attempt to control human existence. The combination is not proof of lost immortality, but it is too coherent to call meaningless. The people of ancient Mesopotamia appear to have understood the flood as the moment when humanity entered a more restricted world, a world of shorter rule, shorter memory, greater separation from the gods, and in some traditions, deliberate limits on birth and life. The water destroyed the cities, but the true consequence came after the water disappeared. The old scale of existence did not return. Kingship came back. Humanity came back. Agriculture came back. Cities came back. But the vast lifespans did not. Something remained on the other side. Perhaps it was divine proximity. Perhaps it was an ancient method of measuring time. Perhaps it was a lost institution represented through the names of kings. Or perhaps it was knowledge. Knowledge of how life could be maintained, renewed, or extended. Because later Mesopotamian stories do not portray immortality as pure fantasy. They portray it as inaccessible. A flood survivor possesses it. The gods guard it. A king searches for it. A plant can restore youth. And a serpent takes that plant away before humanity can benefit from it. The next stage of this investigation leads directly into that forbidden possibility. The idea that human longevity did not simply fade. It was restricted. And according to the stories that followed the king list, the secret of extending life may have survived the flood even if humanity was never allowed to keep it. Chapter 6. The first explanation. The environment changed. The floodwaters eventually disappeared, but the world beneath them did not return. That distinction matters. A catastrophe can end in a day and still continue shaping life for centuries. The rain stops. The rivers fall. The survivors leave their vessels or high ground. But the soil has changed. The food system has collapsed. Fresh water has mixed with salt, waste, and decaying bodies. Animals have disappeared from entire regions. Settlements have been erased. Medicinal plants that once grew nearby are gone. Trade routes no longer connect one city to another. The people who preserved agricultural knowledge may be dead. The people who understood irrigation may be missing. The healers, scribes, builders, and seed keepers may have vanished with everyone else. The water recedes. The disaster remains. This gives us the first grounded explanation for the collapse recorded in the king list. Perhaps human beings did not undergo one sudden biological transformation. Perhaps the conditions that supported long, stable life were destroyed. Imagine a population living inside an organized river civilization. Its people have grain storage, irrigation canals, livestock, medicinal knowledge, clean wells, specialized healers, seasonal calendars, trade networks bringing foods, minerals, and remedies from distant regions. Then, a catastrophic flood destroys the entire system. The survivors are not returning to civilization. They are beginning again inside mud, hunger, and disease. Even a normal regional flood can create years of instability. A catastrophe large enough to become the central boundary in Mesopotamian memory could create something far worse. It could produce famine, waterborne illness, parasites, violence over remaining resources, loss of shelter, exposure to extreme heat and cold, infant mortality, maternal mortality, reduced fertility, chronic malnutrition, entire generations growing up physically weakened by conditions their ancestors did not face. In that world, life would become shorter, not because some invisible switch had been activated inside the human body, but because everything protecting the body had been removed. This may sound obvious, but over centuries, obvious causes become mythological ones. The survivors remember that people lived better before the disaster. Their children hear that people lived longer. Their grandchildren hear that the ancestors were stronger. 10 generations later, the remembered difference becomes enormous. The old people did not merely live 20 years longer. They lived hundreds of years. The earliest kings did not merely preserve more stable dynasties. They ruled for thousands. The scale expands as memory moves farther away from the event. But that does not mean the memory is meaningless. Exaggeration can grow around a real center. A story may become impossible while still preserving a historical truth. There was a world before. That world was more stable. Then catastrophe came, and survival became harder. The Sumerian king list may encode that contrast in the most dramatic language available, time itself. Before the flood, rulers belonged to tens of thousands of years. After the flood, they belong to hundreds. The numbers may not record biological ages. They may record the remembered scale of stability. The pre-flood world appears permanent. The post-flood world becomes fragile. Consider what happens to civilization when a long chain of knowledge is broken. A medical treatment can disappear in one generation if the specialists who understand it die without teaching successors. A crop variety developed over centuries can vanish in a single season. A system of water management can fail when the people who know how to maintain it are gone. A written archive can become unreadable when the last trained scribes disappear. To the survivors, this would not feel like the loss of information. It would feel like the world itself had become less capable. People would become sick from conditions their ancestors knew how to treat. Harvests would fail in places where older farmers once produced abundance. Children would die from causes that had previously been preventable. The human body would appear to have weakened. But perhaps the body had not changed. Perhaps the protective civilization surrounding it had collapsed. There is another possibility. The flood may represent more than water. Ancient societies often compress multiple catastrophes into one narrative: flooding, drought, migration, disease. War. Political collapse. Environmental change. A single story can absorb generations of disruption and preserve them as one great event. The phrase, "the flood swept over," may therefore mark an entire era of breakdown. The end of one climate pattern, the destruction of old settlements, the movement of populations, the loss of food security, the emergence of diseases and crowded refugee communities, the transformation of a landscape that had supported human life for centuries. If the king list's enormous rains symbolize a stable order, the flood symbolizes the moment that stability ended. And once stability disappears, longevity does not need to be genetically altered. It collapses naturally. But there is a problem with this explanation. It accounts for declining life expectancy. It does not fully account for the way Mesopotamian stories describe mortality itself. In those stories, death is not always treated as a simple consequence of harsh living conditions. It is treated as a boundary, something separating gods from humans, something that can be granted, withheld, escaped, or imposed. The flood survivor receives life like a god. Gilgamesh searches for a way around death. A plant can restore youth. Divine beings discuss the control of human reproduction. These are not merely stories about dirty water and lost crops. They are stories about access. Who is allowed to live? Who is allowed to continue? Who possesses the knowledge or substance that overcomes aging? And who does not? The environmental explanation is powerful because it requires no extraordinary technology and no literal immortality. A real disaster destroys the systems that supported health. Later generations remember an age of greater life. The memory expands into thousands of years. But the mythology keeps returning to something darker. The possibility that humanity's new limits were not accidental. The possibility that the catastrophe created an opportunity for those limits to be imposed. The possibility that the old world did not simply disappear. It was replaced. And according to the oldest surviving flood traditions, the forces controlling the replacement did not want humanity to return exactly as it had been before. Chapter 7. The second explanation. Human life was deliberately limited. The darkest interpretation begins with noise. Not war. Not corruption. Not forbidden knowledge. Noise. In the Atrasis tradition, humanity multiplies until its presence becomes unbearable to Enlil. The land is crowded. The people are numerous. Their activity disturbs the divine order. The complaint sounds almost trivial when translated into modern language. Humans are too loud. But in the world of the story, noise is not merely sound. It represents uncontrolled expansion. Too many people. Too much labor. Too much activity. Too much independence. Humanity was created to solve a problem. Now humanity has become another problem. The first response is not the flood. It is disease. A plague is sent to reduce the population. Atrahasis receives help from Enki. The people survive. Then another crisis comes. Drought. The rains fail. The land stops producing. Hunger spreads. Again, knowledge allows some people to endure. Then famine. Each disaster is an attempt to reduce humanity without destroying it completely. Each attempt fails to produce a permanent solution. The population eventually returns. The noise begins again. Then the gods choose the flood. This sequence is important because it shows intention. The catastrophe is not random. It is part of a policy. Human beings have exceeded a limit, and the divine authorities are trying to bring them back under control. After the flood, the problem cannot simply be allowed to repeat. The world cannot be destroyed by water every time humanity becomes numerous. A more permanent system is required. In the surviving tradition, new restrictions appear. Some women will not bear children. Some infants will not survive. Certain priestly or social roles will prevent childbirth. Mortality and infertility become part of the post-flood structure. Humanity continues. But humanity continues under controls. This is where the collapse of the king list becomes difficult to treat as mere coincidence. Before the flood, rulers receive reigns of tens of thousands of years. The wider flood tradition describes humanity growing beyond acceptable limits. The flood comes. Afterward, the rulers' reigns become dramatically shorter. Then mortality, infertility, and population control are integrated into the new order. The text does not give us a scientific description of altered DNA. It does not mention chromosomes, cells, or biological clocks. But mythologically, the message is direct. The human condition after the flood is not the human condition before it. New limitations have been established. Now imagine how this story would sound if translated into modern speculative language. A population was created or organized for a purpose. That population multiplied beyond the expectations of its creators. Initial attempts were made to reduce it through environmental and biological pressure. Those attempts failed. A catastrophic reset was authorized. A selected remnant was preserved. Afterward, the surviving population was placed under permanent reproductive and lifespan restrictions so the original problem would never return. That interpretation sounds disturbingly modern. It resembles the language of management, system control, population regulation, risk reduction. It turns the flood from divine anger into administration, and it turns mortality into policy. This does not prove the story records an actual intervention by technologically advanced beings. Ancient myths regularly portray natural limits as decisions made by gods. Disease becomes a divine weapon. Drought becomes punishment. Infertility becomes a decree. Death becomes the boundary chosen by heaven. The gods personify forces that ancient people could observe but not biologically explain. That is the conventional interpretation, and it may be correct. But even within that interpretation, the mythology reveals something important. The people who preserved the story did not view human lifespan as morally or biologically neutral. They believed limits had a reason. Humans died because a boundary had been placed between humanity and divine existence. Humans reproduced under conditions shaped by the gods. The shortness of life belonged to an imposed order. There is a disturbing logic behind that order. A being that lives 30,000 years accumulates 30,000 years of memory. It gathers knowledge, wealth, influence, and political power beyond anything a short-lived person could challenge. It watches generations appear and disappear. It can plan across millennia. It can preserve projects longer than entire civilizations. If the rulers before the flood were taken literally, they would not merely be old humans. They would represent an almost entirely different class of existence. Their relationship with ordinary people would be unimaginable. A ruler who lives for 30,000 years does not require a dynasty. He is the dynasty. He does not inherit tradition. He personally remembers its beginning. He does not need scribes to preserve the past. He was present. That kind of longevity creates extraordinary power. It also creates extraordinary danger. A population of extremely long-lived beings could expand indefinitely. Its rulers could become impossible to remove. Its knowledge could accumulate faster than any authority could control. If the flood traditions preserve a fear of uncontrolled human growth, limiting lifespan would solve more than a population problem. It would limit memory. It would limit power. It would ensure that every generation begins partially ignorant. Every human being would have to spend the early part of life learning what others already knew. Then, just as experience reached its peak, the body would begin to decline. Finally, death would remove the individual and force the next generation to begin again. Mortality would not only control population, it would control continuity. A short-lived species is easier to govern than an immortal one, because knowledge must constantly be transferred, and every transfer can fail. Every generation forgets something. Every collapse destroys another portion of the memory. Perhaps this is why the king list feels like more than a collection of impossible numbers. It describes not only a collapse in time, but a collapse in direct memory. The first kings belonged to ages they could theoretically remember themselves. Later rulers depend on records. Later generations depend on stories. Eventually, humanity can no longer remember the world before the flood, except through clay tablets whose meaning becomes increasingly uncertain. The shortening of life produces the shortening of history. What one person could once remember across thousands of years must now be preserved through institutions. If those institutions fail, the memory disappears. This gives the post-flood limitation a second function. It separates humanity from its own beginning. People who live only decades cannot personally verify what happened centuries earlier. They inherit narratives controlled by priests, rulers, scribes, and institutions. The past becomes vulnerable to revision. The old world becomes mythology. The rulers who may once have been remembered as real become gods, monsters, or symbols. The memory fragments, and the boundary becomes complete. But why would Enki oppose this? Throughout the flood traditions, Enki appears as the figure who repeatedly prevents humanity's complete destruction. He does not openly cancel the divine assembly's decision. Instead, he works through knowledge. He gives instructions. He reveals patterns. He helps Atrahasis survive disease, drought, and flood. He preserves life by preserving information. That tension between Enlil and Enki may represent competing divine personalities. It may also symbolize two principles: control and knowledge, restriction and adaptation, authority and intelligence. Enlil reduces the population through force. Enki teaches humanity how to survive. The conflict is not resolved by the flood. It continues afterward. Humanity survives, but under limits. Knowledge remains, but in fragments. Life continues, but death dominates it. The result is a compromise. Humans are not destroyed. They are shortened. Their population is not erased. It is regulated. Their intelligence is not removed, but their access to the divine condition is restricted. That may be the world the king list records after the flood. Kingship returns from heaven. But the kings no longer possess heaven's scale of time. They receive authority without immortality. They inherit the office, but not the condition that once accompanied it. And from that moment onward, the greatest kings of Mesopotamia confront the same truth. No amount of power defeats death. No wall is high enough. No city is wealthy enough. No army can protect a king from the limit placed on all humans. This is the realization that eventually drives Gilgamesh away from his throne and into the wilderness. He is not searching for another kingdom. He is searching for the thing humanity lost. Chapter 8, The Plant of Life and the Secret of Immortality. Gilgamesh begins as a king who believes power has no boundary. He is stronger than the men around him. His city is protected by great walls. His name is connected with divine ancestry. He possesses authority, wealth, and physical power beyond ordinary people. Yet none of these things prepares him for the death of Enkidu. Enkidu is not merely a companion. He is the person who makes Gilgamesh fully human. Their friendship transforms arrogance into loyalty. Then Enkidu dies, and for the first time, Gilgamesh sees his own future. The body beside him is not an abstract lesson. It is evidence. Strength ends. Youth ends. Love ends. The person who was speaking can become silent. The eyes that recognized him can become empty. Gilgamesh refuses to accept it. He watches Enkidu's body until decay makes denial impossible. Then fear enters him. Not fear of an enemy. Fear of time. Gilgamesh understands that the boundary which took Enkidu will take him as well. The walls of Uruk will remain. His name may remain, but he will not. That realization changes the direction of his life. He leaves the city. The king abandons kingship, because kingship cannot answer the only question that now matters. How can a human escape death? His journey leads toward Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood. Utnapishtim occupies a unique position. He was once human. He lived in the old world. He received a warning. He built the vessel. He survived the catastrophe. And after the flood, he and his wife were granted a form of life unavailable to ordinary humanity. Gilgamesh believes this makes Utnapishtim the keeper of the secret. If one human crossed the boundary, perhaps another can cross it as well. The journey is dangerous because immortality is not portrayed as knowledge available inside civilization. It lies far away, beyond ordinary routes, beyond the waters of death, at the edge of the human world. This geography is symbolic. The farther Gilgamesh travels, the farther he moves from normal human conditions. He is not merely looking for an object. He is trying to reach the other side of mortality. When he finally finds Utnapishtim, the answer is not what he expects. The flood survivor does not offer a simple formula. He explains that his own fate was exceptional. The gods made a decision once. That decision cannot be repeated merely because another king is afraid. Gilgamesh is forced to confront the possibility that immortality is not a human achievement. It is permission, a privilege, a condition granted by powers outside humanity. Still, Utnapishtim tests him. If Gilgamesh wishes to overcome death, he must first overcome sleep. The test appears almost unfairly simple. Stay awake. But sleep is death's daily shadow. Every night, consciousness disappears. The body becomes still. The individual loses control. If Gilgamesh cannot resist sleep for a few days, how can he claim the ability to resist death forever? He fails almost immediately. The failure is humiliating. The greatest king cannot control the most ordinary weakness of the body. He can defeat monsters. He cannot defeat exhaustion. Gilgamesh prepares to leave. Then another secret is revealed. There is a plant beneath the water. A plant associated with renewal. A plant capable of restoring youth. This changes everything. Immortality may remain unavailable, but aging might be reversible. Gilgamesh descends into the deep. He secures stones to his feet. He reaches the bottom. He finds the plant. He cuts it. He rises with the object that may undo the decline recorded throughout human history. The moment should be triumphant. But Gilgamesh does not immediately consume it. He plans to take it back. He wants to test it. He wants to share or verify its power. This hesitation reveals that he has changed. The arrogant king who once thought only of himself now imagines renewal reaching beyond his own body. For a brief moment, humanity possesses the means to regain what was lost. Then Gilgamesh stops to bathe. A serpent smells the plant. It approaches. It takes the plant. As it leaves, it sheds its skin. The symbol is brutal. The serpent receives renewal. Humanity does not. The creature disappears with the secret, leaving Gilgamesh to return home empty-handed. This episode is sometimes treated as a simple explanation for why snakes shed their skin. But within the larger Mesopotamian obsession with lost longevity, it carries far greater weight. The plant exists. The means of renewal exists. A human reaches it. But the human cannot keep it. The pattern is consistent. Life is not impossible. It is inaccessible. The gods possess it. The flood survivor receives it. The plant contains it. The serpent takes it. Humanity approaches the boundary repeatedly and repeatedly loses access. This is why the story matters to the king list. The list begins with rulers whose reigns are almost beyond time. Gilgamesh belongs to a much later world. He is powerful, partly divine in later tradition, and remembered as one of the greatest kings. But he is still trapped inside mortality. He stands downstream from the collapse. The old age is over. The kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years are gone. Now even the greatest ruler must travel to the end of the world to search for a fragment of what they appear to have possessed naturally. The plant may represent medicine. It may represent wisdom. It may symbolize youth itself. It may preserve a memory of rare botanical knowledge. Or it may function as a narrative demonstration that the human desire to overcome aging is destined to fail. But the story contains an unsettling implication. The problem is not that the human body can never be renewed. The problem is that the knowledge or substance required for renewal does not remain in human hands. That is a different kind of tragedy. An impossible dream can be abandoned. A stolen possibility cannot. If Gilgamesh had never found the plant, mortality would appear absolute, because he finds it and loses it. Mortality appears imposed by circumstance. Human beings die, not because renewal does not exist, but because they cannot maintain access to it. This creates a pattern across Mesopotamian tradition. The first kings possess vast time. The flood divides the ages. Human lifespan shrinks. One survivor receives divine life. Later kings search for it. A plant offers youth. The plant is lost. The old condition remains visible but unreachable. The serpent's role deepens the symbolism. Snakes appear to renew themselves by shedding their skin. To ancient observers, the animal could seem to emerge from an old body into a new one. Human beings also change skin, heal wounds, and replace cells, but the process is invisible and incomplete. The serpent appears to perform outwardly what humanity desires inwardly. It escapes its old surface. It continues. The story may be saying that nature retains the pattern of renewal, while humans have lost the complete version of it. This raises another question. What exactly were the pre-flood kings? If ordinary humanity was always mortal, perhaps the rulers with 30,000-year reigns were never ordinary humans. Perhaps the king list is not a record of lost human lifespan. Perhaps it is a record of a different category of ruler. Beings close enough to humanity to govern cities, but close enough to the divine world to exist on another scale of time. The title king may be leading us to imagine human bodies where the ancient text intended something far stranger. Chapter 9, were the first kings even human? The Sumerian king list gives names. It gives cities. It gives reigns. What it does not give is a biological description. The text does not pause to explain whether Alulim looked like an ordinary person. It does not tell us whether he was born, aged, and died. It does not describe his parents. It does not tell us what substance his body was made from. It simply calls him king. Modern readers hear that word and imagine a human ruler, a man wearing a crown, a palace, a court, soldiers, servants, a recognizable political figure. But the earliest section of the list belongs to a mythological environment where the line between gods, heroes, sages, and rulers is not always clear. Kingship descends from heaven. Some names are connected with divine traditions. The reigns operate on a cosmic scale. The cities belong to the sacred geography of the beginning. Perhaps the first rulers were never meant to be understood as ordinary humans. This gives us several possibilities. The first is that they were gods. Ancient Mesopotamian gods were not distant abstractions. They owned cities. They possessed temples. They received food, clothing, and ritual service. They participated in political authority. A city's human king governed under divine legitimacy, but the city ultimately belonged to its deity. The earliest kings may represent a memory of divine rulership before human monarchies fully emerged. In that reading, their enormous reigns make sense. Gods do not age according to human limits. A reign of 36,000 years communicates divine duration. The flood then marks the transition from gods ruling directly to human kings ruling under divine authority. Kingship returns after the flood, but now its holders are increasingly mortal. The second possibility is that the kings were demigods or hybrid figures. Gilgamesh himself is later described as partly divine. His extraordinary strength and status place him between ordinary humanity and the gods. The earlier rulers may have occupied an even more elevated position. Their bodies may have been imagined as human enough to rule cities, but divine enough to survive for vast periods. This would explain the gradual decline. The earliest rulers are close to heaven. Later kings possess mixed or reduced divine qualities. Eventually, kings become fully historical humans. The king list would then record not just political succession, but decreasing divine content. The third possibility is that each king represents a dynasty. This remains one of the most practical explanations. The name of a founding ruler could become attached to an entire period of rule. Later scribes, working with fragmented traditions, may have treated the dynasty as one person. Imagine a line of rulers who all inherit the same sacred title. Centuries later, the title is remembered as a name. The entire institution becomes one king. The reign expands because it represents generations rather than one body. This process is not difficult to imagine. Even in modern speech, we use one name to describe long political periods. We speak of houses, empires, and ages as though they possess one continuous identity. A future civilization with incomplete records might misunderstand those labels as individuals. But once again, the total durations remain extreme. A dynasty lasting 800 years would require continuity far beyond any known political system, unless the numbers are symbolic or astronomical. The fourth possibility is that the kings represent celestial entities. The earliest civilizations connected political order with the sky. Planets moved across the heavens like wandering powers. Constellations appeared and disappeared with the seasons. Astronomical cycles determined planting, festivals, navigation, and ritual. A primordial king could personify a celestial period. His reign might be the interval during which a particular astronomical configuration dominated the calendar. The transfer of kingship between cities could encode transitions between religious centers associated with different celestial traditions. The flood could mark a calendrical reset or astronomical boundary. This interpretation fits the enormous, structured numbers. It also explains why ordinary biological limits may be irrelevant, but no universally accepted decoding system exists. The names do not map cleanly onto known planets or constellations in a way that settles the question. The theory remains attractive, but uncertain. The fifth possibility is that the rulers were remembered culture bringers, not gods in the highest sense, not ordinary humans, but beings who established the institutions that defined civilization. This brings us to a category of figures closely connected with the pre-flood world. The Apkallu. The Apkallu are often described as sages, wise figures, teachers associated with ancient knowledge. In later traditions, they are connected with the transmission of writing, ritual, crafts, law, and civilization. Some are associated with the period before the flood. Others belong to the world after it. And the distinction between the two groups is revealing. The pre-flood sages appear closer to the divine. The later sages appear more human. This mirrors the decline in the king list. Before the flood, rulers possess impossible time. Before the flood, sages possess extraordinary status. After the flood, both kingship and wisdom remain. But both are diminished. That parallel may not be accidental. Perhaps kingship and knowledge were two parts of the same system. The king maintained order. The sage carried the instructions required to maintain civilization. If the earliest kings were not ordinary humans, the earliest sages may not have been ordinary teachers. They may represent the source from which the entire human system was established. Their knowledge did not grow gradually through trial and error. It arrived. Agriculture, building, writing, ritual, measurement, law, medicine. The same pattern appears in the opening line of the king list. Kingship descends from heaven. Civilization does not begin as a human invention. It is delivered. This is one of the reasons Sumerian history attracts so much speculation. The archaeological story shows real development over long periods. Villages grew. Agriculture expanded. Administrative systems became more complex. Writing developed from earlier accounting practices. There is evidence of human innovation. Yet Mesopotamian tradition often describes the foundations of civilization as gifts from divine sources. Ancient people may simply have expressed human discoveries through religious language. The god of wisdom gave irrigation because irrigation was part of sacred order. A deity revealed writing because writing seemed too transformative to be treated as ordinary invention. That is a reasonable reading. But the stories remain remarkably consistent in one respect. The earliest knowledge belongs to beings who are not fully ordinary humans. The world after the flood inherits fragments of what they knew. This creates a new possibility for the lifespan mystery. Perhaps the enormous rains did not describe an ancient human population in which every farmer lived for 30,000 years. Perhaps they described a small ruling class belonging to another category. Their longevity may have been divine symbolism. It may have reflected dynasties. It may have represented astronomical cycles. Or it may have preserved the memory of beings believed to possess a fundamentally different lifespan. In every case, the collapse after the flood represents a change in who controls civilization. Before the flood, the rulers and sages belonged closer to heaven. After the flood, humanity receives kingship and knowledge in reduced form. The office remains. The original holders disappear. That may be why later kings are obsessed with recovering ancient wisdom. They do not see themselves as inventors of a new future. They see themselves as restorers of an older order. They rebuild temples on ancient foundations. They search for old inscriptions. They claim to recover rituals established at the beginning. Their authority depends on remembering what came before. The past is not primitive. It is authoritative. And the farther back they look, the greater the authority becomes. At the deepest point stand the pre-flood kings and sages, the beings who remember the first cities, the ones who possessed knowledge before human records began, the ones who disappear when the water comes. If the key to longevity existed in that world, it may have vanished with them. But not everything disappeared. Some knowledge crossed the flood. Some names survived. Some teachings were preserved. And according to Mesopotamian tradition, the beings responsible for carrying civilization into the human world were the Apkallu. Chapter 10, the Apkallu and the knowledge that disappeared. Before the flood, there were sages, not philosophers sitting in quiet schools, not scholars, copying old books. The sages belonged to the foundation of civilization itself. They were remembered as beings of extraordinary wisdom who brought the principles that made organized human life possible. The later Mesopotamian tradition calls them Apkallu. Their identity changes across texts and periods. Sometimes they appear as ancient sages connected with kings. sometimes as protective figures, sometimes as beings associated with the god of wisdom, sometimes in art as human figures wearing fish-like garments, or as composite beings with wings or animal features. The variation makes simple definitions difficult, but their central function remains stable. They carry knowledge from the divine realm into the human world. The first of them is often associated with Oannes in later accounts, a mysterious teacher said to have emerged from the sea and instructed humanity in the arts of civilization: writing, agriculture, building, law, measurement, the organization of cities. The story is extraordinary because the teacher does not merely offer one discovery. He delivers a complete civilizational package. The people do not spend centuries experimenting toward these systems. They receive instruction. This parallels the king list. Kingship descends from heaven. Wisdom emerges from the deep. Civilization begins through transmission. The image of the sea teacher may be mythological. Water was associated with wisdom, creation, and the subterranean freshwater realm of Enki. A being emerging from water could symbolize knowledge arising from the divine deep. But the story also preserves the idea that the foundational system came from outside ordinary human society. It was introduced by a figure who crossed a boundary. Before the flood, the Apkallu are described as extraordinarily wise. They belong to the age when the connection between the divine world and human civilization is open. They serve ancient kings. They establish rituals. They guide construction. They organize knowledge. Then the flood comes. Afterward, the tradition changes. The later sages are not identical to the first ones. They become more human. Some traditions describe them as partly divine and partly mortal. Others place human scholars in the line of succession that descends from the ancient Apkallu. The pattern is familiar. Before the flood, wisdom is vast and direct. After the flood, wisdom becomes inherited, fragmented, and increasingly human. This mirrors the reign lengths. The rulers become shorter-lived. The sages become less divine. The distance from the original source increases. What if the collapse in lifespan and the collapse in knowledge are the same event seen from two directions? A being living for tens of thousands of years could master more than one discipline. Astronomy over thousands of cycles. Medicine across countless generations. Agriculture through centuries of climate change. Engineering projects planned beyond the lifespan of ordinary human institutions. Long life would create deep knowledge naturally. Shortening lifespan would break that continuity. A human living 80 years cannot personally observe a 600-year cycle. The observation must pass through records. Those records must survive political collapse, war, fire, translation, and changing language. One error can corrupt generations of calculation. A long-lived observer could simply wait. A short-lived civilization must build institutions to remember for it. This may be why longevity and wisdom appear together in primordial traditions. The oldest beings live longest because they must carry the longest memory. When lifespan collapses, knowledge must be externalized, pressed into clay, carved into stone, encoded in ritual, attached to temples, repeated through priesthoods. Human beings become dependent on storage. The clay tablet becomes a substitute for the immortal mind. That may be the hidden importance of writing in this story. Writing is usually celebrated as civilization's great achievement. But writing may also be evidence of limitation. A being with perfect memory and an immense lifespan may not require archives. A short-lived species does. We write because we forget. We build libraries because bodies die. We record names because voices disappear. The Sumerian king list itself may exist because the condition it describes has been lost. The kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years no longer remain to tell their own story. Their names must be pressed into clay by people who live only decades. The list is not merely a record of long life. It is a response to short life, a technology of remembrance created inside a world that can no longer remember naturally. This helps explain why the Apkallu matter. They represent the long memory, the complete knowledge, the original instructions. The world after the flood does not receive that knowledge intact. It receives fragments. Rituals whose purposes may already be partially forgotten, astronomical tables copied by scribes who preserve the numbers even when the original observations are lost. Medical practices combining careful treatment with incantation because practical and sacred knowledge have become inseparable. Building traditions repeated across generations because this is how the ancients did it. The form survives. The full explanation fades. This is how knowledge disappears without vanishing completely. A later civilization can preserve an instruction while forgetting the principle behind it. It can repeat a ceremony without understanding its original function. It can copy a number without knowing why the number matters. It can remember a king's 800-year reign while forgetting what the number was designed to encode. The king list may be exactly that kind of survival. A fragment of a system whose key has been lost. The scribes know the names. They know the cities. They know the totals. They know the flood divides the ages. But perhaps they no longer know whether a reign represents a body, a dynasty, a celestial cycle, or an institution. They copy the tradition because it is sacred, because it legitimizes kingship, because it belongs to the beginning, because changing it would break the chain connecting their own rulers to heaven. The numbers survive longer than their explanation. That is one of the most haunting possibilities in the entire investigation. The tablet may be accurate within a system we no longer understand, not accurate as a modern biological record, accurate as an encoded chronology, accurate as sacred mathematics, accurate as the duration of a forgotten institution, accurate as a symbolic description of decline. The problem may not be that the Sumerians wrote impossible numbers. The problem may be that we have lost the category those numbers belong to. The Apkallu tradition gives us a possible reason for that loss. The original sages disappear with the first world. Later sages inherit portions of their knowledge. Human scholars maintain the line, but each generation is farther from the source. Eventually, the teachings become mythology. The fish-cloaked instructors become supernatural creatures. The ancient kings become impossible legends. The flood becomes a moral story. The mathematical structures remain embedded in texts, but the civilization capable of interpreting the complete pattern no longer exists. This is how the long memory dies. Not through one act of destruction, through reduction. The flood destroys the first world. Short lifespans reduce direct memory. Political collapse scatters archives. Languages change. Scribes copy damaged texts. New religions reinterpret old gods. Symbols survive while meanings shift. The world remembers that knowledge was given. It forgets what the knowledge contained. It remembers that people once lived longer. It forgets what longer meant. It remembers that the flood changed everything. It forgets how. And yet the memory never disappears completely. It remains in the reigns of the 8 kings, in the story of the flood survivor, in Gilgamesh's search, in the stolen plant, in the serpent's renewed skin, in the sages who brought civilization from the deep. All of these traditions circle the same absence. Humanity once stood closer to something. Longer life, deeper knowledge, direct contact with the source of civilization. Then a boundary appeared. The flood may have been that boundary, or it may have become the symbol for a much larger transition, a transition from beings who remembered across ages to humans who remember across generations. From direct knowledge to written knowledge, from divine kings to mortal rulers, from 30,000 years to 30. That does not tell us whether Ululam was a literal person who watched the world turn for 2,800 years. It tells us why his number mattered. He stands at the beginning of the long memory. We stand at the other end. Between us lies the flood, the collapse, and thousands of years of human forgetting. And the next question is no longer only whether such lifespans were possible. The question is whether aging itself is as fixed as it appears, because modern biology has begun to discover something the ancient stories assumed from the beginning. The length of life is not controlled by one clock. It is the result of many systems, systems that fail, systems that can sometimes be slowed, systems that, at least in other forms of life, operate very differently from our own. Science offers no evidence that humans once lived for 30,000 years. But it does reveal that nature has never imposed one universal lifespan on every living thing. And that opens the door to the next stage of the mystery, not whether ancient kings were immortal, but whether the human limit could ever have been different. Chapter 11. Could longevity have been biological? There is a temptation at this point to choose between two extremes. Either the Sumerian kings literally lived for tens of thousands of years, or the numbers are meaningless mythology. But biology does not always divide reality so neatly. Modern science offers no evidence that any human being has ever lived for 30,000 years. No verified skeleton shows signs of such an age. No genetic data demonstrates that prehistoric humans possessed near-immortal bodies. No accepted archaeological record supports individual reigns lasting for millennia. That must be stated clearly. But another fact is equally important. Aging is not a single, unchangeable law, operating identically in every living creature. It is a biological process, and biological processes vary. Some organisms live for hours. Others live for centuries. A mouse may survive only a few years. A human may live more than a century. Certain whales can remain alive for more than 200 years. Some tortoises survive beyond the lifespan of the people who first studied them. Certain deep-sea organisms appear to age extremely slowly. Some animals can regenerate damaged tissue in ways humans cannot. And there are simple organisms whose biological systems challenge the ordinary distinction between aging and renewal. Nature has not assigned one universal lifespan to life. It has built many different clocks. The question is, what controls those clocks? Inside the human body, aging does not occur because one hidden timer reaches zero. It emerges from many interacting failures. DNA accumulates damage. Cells lose the ability to divide correctly. Proteins become damaged or misfolded. Mitochondria become less efficient. Inflammation increases. Stem cell reserves decline. Immune responses weaken. The systems responsible for repairing the body gradually become less capable of repairing themselves. Aging is therefore not one event. It is the slow collapse of maintenance. This is important because the ancient stories repeatedly portray long life as something connected with access. Access to divine food, access to a plant, access to secret knowledge, access to a protected place, access to a condition ordinary humans no longer possess. The language is mythological, but the underlying idea is surprisingly biological. Long life depends on maintenance. If a body could repair its DNA more effectively, remove damaged cells more efficiently, preserve stem cells, maintain proteins, and suppress cancer, its lifespan could theoretically increase. The difficulty is that improving one system can damage another. Cells that divide continuously may repair tissue, but uncontrolled division becomes cancer. An immune system that remains highly active may protect against infection, but excessive activity damages the body through inflammation. Metabolism provides energy, but it also creates byproducts that contribute to cellular stress. The body is a balance of compromises. This may be why human aging has proved so difficult to defeat. The systems that preserve life can also destroy it when pushed too far. Still, researchers have learned that lifespan is not completely fixed. Changes in diet, environment, disease exposure, and medical care can alter how long populations live. In laboratory organisms, genetic and metabolic interventions can extend lifespans significantly. None of this brings science close to 30,000 years, but it does demonstrate that aging can be modified. That changes the philosophical question. The human lifespan is not a perfectly rigid number written into the universe. It is an outcome produced by biological systems under particular conditions. Could those conditions have been different in the distant past? Not different enough, according to existing evidence, to support literal 30,000-year human lives, but different enough to shape ancient memories of longevity. Possibly. Imagine an elite class in an early civilization with access to better nutrition, cleaner water, medicine, protection from violence, and ritualized health practices unavailable to ordinary people. Their lives would appear extraordinarily long compared with the population around them. If most people died young from disease or childbirth, a ruler who reached 80 could seem almost supernatural. Over generations, 90 years becomes 900. A royal lineage becomes one ruler. A stable dynasty becomes a life-lasting centuries. The memory grows. The biological advantage becomes mythology. There is also the difference between maximum lifespan and average life expectancy. In harsh ancient conditions, average life expectancy could be low, because many children died before adulthood. That does not mean every adult died at 30. People who survived childhood could live much longer. A later population remembering the oldest members of an earlier society might transform exceptional age into a defining feature of the entire era. The oldest person becomes the ancestor. The ancestor becomes a king. The king becomes nearly immortal. But this still leaves one uncomfortable pattern. Ancient stories do not simply say the ancestors lived longer. They repeatedly connect lost longevity with lost knowledge. The flood survivor knows something Gilgamesh does not. The gods possess substances humans cannot keep. The sages of the first world carry wisdom later generations inherit only in fragments. This suggests that longevity was not imagined as an accident of health. It was imagined as a technology, privilege, or condition that could be transmitted. What would such a condition look like in biological terms? It might involve more effective DNA repair, different regulation of cellular aging, better cancer suppression, slower metabolism, reduced exposure to disease, medicinal compounds that supported tissue renewal, a protected environment, or some combination of systems modern science has only begun to understand. Again, there is no evidence the Sumerians possessed such technology, but the conceptual structure of their stories is clear. Long life belongs to those closer to the source of knowledge. Short life belongs to the world after separation. That relationship between knowledge and longevity appears throughout human history. Healers search for medicines that preserve youth. Rulers seek elixirs. Priests guard rituals of renewal. Alchemists pursue substances said to extend life. Explorers search for fountains. Modern laboratories study senescent cells, gene regulation, and tissue regeneration. The vocabulary changes. The desire does not. Humanity continues Gilgamesh's journey with different tools. The ancient king walked beyond the waters of death. Modern researchers enter the cell. Both are searching for the same hidden mechanism. Why does the body stop repairing itself? Why does youth disappear? Why can certain organisms regenerate while humans decline? Why does the biological system contain the capacity to build a body from a single cell, yet eventually lose the ability to maintain that body? The existence of aging is so familiar that it appears natural. But familiarity is not explanation. The body knows how to create youth. Every newborn proves that. The mystery is why that knowledge becomes less accessible with time. The ancient stories answer mythologically. The gods withheld it. The plant was stolen. The first sages disappeared. The flood separated humanity from the old condition. Modern biology answers mechanistically. Gene expression changes. Repair systems weaken. Damage accumulates. Cells become senescent. The explanations belong to different worlds, but they circle the same fact. The body loses access to renewal. This may be why the serpent in Gilgamesh is such a powerful image. It sheds its old skin. It appears to begin again. The plant of renewal passes from a human king to a creature that visibly escapes its former surface. The story does not say nature lost the secret. It says humanity did. That may also help explain why the Sumerian kings are measured through reigns rather than lifespans. The text is not interested in their private bodies. It is interested in continuity. A king who rules for thousands of years represents a system that does not break. A city that holds kingship for tens of thousands of years represents order that survives generation after generation. Longevity is political as much as biological. It means the world remains stable. The collapse of lifespan therefore becomes the collapse of continuity. Kings die. Dynasties fracture. Knowledge must be transferred. Mistakes multiply. Every generation becomes a possible point of failure. The flood may not have shortened the human body in one moment. It may have introduced the world in which nothing lasts. This is where biology and mythology meet. Aging is biological instability. Civilizational decline is institutional instability. The king list may use one language to describe both. Before the flood, bodies, kingship, and knowledge appear continuous. After the flood, all three become temporary. But if the reigns were not literal biological ages, why were they expressed with such exact mathematical structure? Why 28,800? Why 36,000? Why 43,2000? Why not simply say the kings ruled for countless generations? The answer may be hidden not in the body, but in the number system, because the lifespans of the antediluvian rulers do not merely look large, they look calculated. And when those calculations are examined, the kings begin to resemble parts of a machine built from 60, 600, and 3,600, a machine that may not have been measuring human life at all. Chapter 12, the mathematics hidden inside the lifespans. The number 43 Cosiner 200 appears in the king list as the reign of Enmen-Luana. Uana, to a modern reader, it looks like an extreme but otherwise arbitrary value. To a Mesopotamian scribe, it did not. 43 3,000, 200 is 12 times 3,600. 36,000 is 10 times 3,600. 28,800 is 8 times 3,600. The numbers are built from a system. They belong to the mathematics of ancient Mesopotamia, a mathematical world organized around 60. We still live inside fragments of that world. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These divisions are so familiar that they feel universal. They are not. They descend from ancient mathematical traditions, in which 60 offered exceptional flexibility. 60 divides cleanly by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. That makes it useful for fractions, measurement, and calculation. The Sumerian and Babylonian mathematical systems used powers and multiples of 60 in ways that shaped astronomy, trade, and administration. Within that framework, 3,600 was not merely a large number. It was 60 multiplied by 60, a square of the base, a complete, large unit. The pre-flood reigns are repeatedly constructed from this unit. That suggests the scribes were not estimating, they were arranging. The numbers have architecture. This matters because symbolic systems rarely choose values accidentally. If one ruler receives 8 large units, another 10, and another 12, the sequence may communicate order. The reigns may function like ratios. Each king occupies a measured place inside a larger chronology. The 8 pre-flood rulers together total 200 years. That total is itself divisible within the sexagesimal framework. The pre-flood age is not a vague eternity. It has been calculated. Someone expected the reader to recognize the structure. Perhaps the reigns were sacred numbers indicating rank. A ruler associated with 12 units occupies a greater cosmic position than one associated with 5. Perhaps the values corresponded with cycles known to the scribes, but no longer recoverable. Perhaps each king represented a sequence of astronomical observations. Or perhaps the entire list was designed to express how divine time becomes human time. There is a clue in the way large numbers function in myth. A mythological number does not have to mean the event literally lasted that long. It can create distance. It can tell the audience that the event belongs outside ordinary experience. A ruler who reigns for 3,000 years cannot be compared with a ruler who reigns for 43. The numbers place the first kings in another category. They are not merely better kings. They exist in another scale of reality. But why use the same kind of mathematical units found in astronomy? Because astronomy is the study of cycles that exceed human life. A person can watch the moon complete a month. A person can observe the sun complete a year. But other cycles require generations of record-keeping. The return of certain planetary configurations. The slow movement of stars against seasonal positions. Long eclipse patterns. Changes visible only when records are compared across centuries. Astronomy forces short-lived humans to think in time beyond themselves. That makes it a natural language for primordial kingship. The earliest kings may represent cosmic order, because cosmic order is the most enduring order available. Stars return. Planets follow paths. Seasons repeat. The king's role was to preserve order on Earth in harmony with order in the sky. A reign expressed through astronomical numbers would therefore say more than, he ruled a long time. It would say his kingship participated in the structure of the cosmos. Some researchers have attempted to connect the king list's numbers with larger astronomical cycles. They point to recurring values such as 3,643 PN 200. They note that multiplying or dividing such numbers can produce values resembling calendrical or precessional intervals. These interpretations are attractive because the numbers clearly are structured. But caution is necessary. A flexible number system can generate many apparent correspondences. If enough multiplication and division are allowed, almost any ancient number can be made to resemble an astronomical cycle. A genuine decoding requires more than resemblance. It requires a consistent rule. The same method must explain every reign. It must fit the cities. It must clarify the flood boundary. It must be supported by known Sumerian concepts. No single astronomical solution has achieved universal acceptance. But the absence of a confirmed code does not make the structure irrelevant. The numbers still tell us the pre-flood section was composed according to a logic. The scribes were not merely exaggerating randomly. Consider the difference. A storyteller exaggerating might say a king ruled for 10,000 years, then another for 1,000,000, then another for 100,000. The values would serve only to impress. The king list repeatedly returns to multiples of recognized large units. That looks more like calculation than improvisation. The numbers may preserve traces of an older system. Perhaps the scribes copied values whose original meaning they no longer fully understood. This happens often in cultural transmission. A ritual survives after its explanation is lost. A measurement is preserved after the object it measured disappears. A title remains after the institution changes. A calendar retains the name of a forgotten god. The form becomes more durable than the meaning. The king list may be an ancient example. The scribes knew the reigns. They knew the order of cities. They knew the total. But perhaps the key explaining why Alulim received 8 large units and Alongar 10 had already vanished. The list could have been sacred enough to preserve and old enough to misunderstand. If so, the impossible reigns are not inventions. They are fossils of an earlier intellectual system. The same possibility applies to the flood. Perhaps it represents a point where one chronology ended and another began. Pre-flood time may have been measured through ceremonial or astronomical units. Post-flood time may gradually shift toward human regnal years. The apparent collapse would then be a conversion problem. It would resemble comparing kilometers with meters, while assuming both numbers use the same unit. A reign of 2800 in one system might not be biologically longer than a reign of 80 in another. The text never tells us a conversion occurred. But ancient audiences may not have needed the explanation. They may have recognized the distinction between primordial and historical chronology automatically. The earliest section belonged to sacred time. The later section belonged to political time. The flood was the boundary between them. This could explain why the first post-flood reigns remain enormous but much smaller. The transition between systems may not have been immediate. Mythological and historical traditions overlapped. Heroic rulers remained larger than life. As the list approached periods supported by administrative records, the numbers stabilized. The chronology became ordinary because the evidence became ordinary. Yet this explanation raises an emotional problem. If the numbers are only chronology, why do later myths obsess over lost immortality? Why does Gilgamesh search for eternal life? Why does the flood survivor receive a special condition? Why does a plant restore youth? Why do the earliest sages belong to a superior age? The mathematical reading explains the structure. It does not erase the cultural belief in decline. The Sumerians and later Mesopotamians appear to have imagined the distant past as a world of greater access to divine power and knowledge. Whether the kings lived for 30,000 years is secondary to what the numbers communicate. The first age was bigger. The first rulers were closer to heaven. The first knowledge was more complete. The first order lasted longer. Then the scale collapsed. There may also be a political reason for the mathematics. A current ruler gains legitimacy when his reign becomes the latest term in a sequence extending hundreds of thousands of years. His kingdom may be young. His dynasty may be unstable. His enemies may challenge him. But the institution he claims to represent is older than the flood. It descended from heaven. It survived catastrophe. It passed through the greatest cities. Now it belongs to him. The impossible chronology transforms a vulnerable human king into the temporary holder of an eternal office. The king dies. Kingship remains. This may be the true immortal entity in the king list. Not Alulim, not Alongar, not Enmenlu Anna. Kingship itself. It descends before the flood. It survives the destruction of the world. It descends again afterward. Cities fall, but kingship moves. Dynasties disappear, but kingship continues. The ruler's enormous reigns may express the duration of the institution rather than the body. That possibility changes the mystery again. Perhaps the tablet never claimed human beings were immortal. Perhaps it claimed legitimate order was. The flood could destroy cities, but not the principle that organized them. Yet the post-flood numbers still decline. If kingship is immortal, its human vessels become increasingly temporary. The office remains divine. The holder becomes mortal. That is the tragedy at the center of Gilgamesh. He can possess kingship. He cannot possess its immortality. The walls of Europe can outlive him. The institution can outlive him. The story can outlive him, but the body cannot. The mathematical structure may therefore be doing several things at once. It encodes sacred order. It exaggerates primordial authority. It separates divine time from human time. It supports political legitimacy. It preserves fragments of lost chronology. And it creates the impression of declining human continuity. This complexity is why no single explanation has settled the question. The numbers behave like symbols. They also behave like calculations. The list contains mythology. It also preserves real rulers. The flood functions as theology. It may also preserve cultural memory of disaster. The earliest kings may be divine. They may represent dynasties. They may encode cycles. Or they may combine all three. The mistake may be assuming only one answer can be true. Ancient texts were not written inside modern categories. They did not separate religion from politics, mathematics from ritual, or history from cosmic order in the way we do. A reign could be a chronological value, a theological statement, and a political claim simultaneously. That brings us to the three strongest solutions. Not because one must eliminate the others, but because each reveals a different layer of what the tablet was designed to preserve. Chapter 13, Three Competing Solutions to the Mystery. After examining the kings, the flood, the mathematics, the mythology, the sages, and the biology, three explanations remain stronger than the others. Each solves part of the mystery. Each creates another problem. The first is the conventional explanation. The antediluvian rains are mythological inflation. The earliest kings were legendary figures. Their reigns became enormous because ancient cultures associated the distant past with divine scale. The numbers communicate prestige, not biology. As the list moves toward historically recorded periods, the reigns become realistic because the scribes possessed better information. This explanation is strong. It fits the political purpose of the list. It accounts for the blend of myth and history. It requires no lost technology, no altered human biology, and no literal immortals. It also matches a broader human tendency. The farther the past moves from verifiable memory, the greater its heroes become. Founders become giants. Ancestors become demigods. Battles become impossible victories. Rulers become almost eternal. The king list may simply be one of the oldest surviving examples of that process. But the conventional explanation does not fully resolve the mathematics. Why are the reigns structured in large sexagesimal units? Why are totals calculated? Why does the flood create such a sharp chronological break? Why do later myths connect the same catastrophe with mortality, population limits, and exceptional survivors? Mythological inflation explains why the numbers are huge. It does not fully explain why they are huge in this particular way. The second explanation is encoded chronology. The reigns may not represent human lifespans at all. They may represent dynasties, institutions, astronomical periods, or sacred units of time. The names may serve as labels for epochs. The cities may mark political or ritual centers. The transfer of kingship may describe the movement of authority across long spans. The flood may separate two calendrical systems. This explanation fits the mathematical structure. It treats the numbers seriously without requiring biological impossibility. It explains why 3600 appears repeatedly. It explains why the values feel calculated. It also fits the possibility that later scribes preserved an older system whose key had been lost. But encoded chronology faces its own problem. What is the code? What is the code? A successful theory must do more than say, the numbers symbolize cycles. It must identify the cycles consistently. It must explain why each king receives his specific value. It must show how the city sequence relates to the mathematics. It must clarify the post-flood decline. Without such a key, encoded chronology remains plausible but unproven. The third explanation is the most controversial. The king list preserves a distorted memory of a genuinely different earlier condition, not necessarily ordinary humans living for 30,000 solar years, but a pre-flood world in which rulers, dynasties, elite groups, or civilization itself possessed far greater continuity. Perhaps environmental conditions supported better health. Perhaps knowledge of medicine and biological maintenance was later lost. Perhaps the earliest rulers were considered partly divine. Perhaps their names represented long-lived ruling lineages. Perhaps the story preserves cultural memory of people who appeared almost immortal compared with later populations. This explanation takes the ancient belief in decline seriously. It connects the king list with the flood traditions, the sages, Gilgamesh, and the plant of renewal. It explains why the collapse is not only numerical. After the flood, everything becomes smaller. Lifespans, knowledge, direct contact with divine beings, political continuity, human confidence. The first world possesses order. The later world searches for what was lost. But this model lacks direct physical evidence for extreme longevity. No verified biological record supports human lives lasting for millennia. The archaeological record shows gradual cultural development, not the clear disappearance of an immortal ruling species. The theory can easily expand beyond evidence into speculation. That danger must be acknowledged. Still, the absence of literal immortality does not eliminate the possibility of a real memory beneath the myth. A civilization can remember a genuine decline while exaggerating its scale. A dynasty can become a person. A century can become 1,000 years. A medical tradition can become the plant of life. A cultural collapse can become a universal flood. A ruling elite can become gods. The memory changes, but the direction remains. There was more before. There is less now. These three explanations are often treated as enemies. They may instead be layers. The earliest rulers may have begun as cultural memories of ancient political or ritual figures. Their names may have become attached to dynasties. Their dynasties may have been expressed through sacred mathematical units. Later scribes may have placed those traditions inside a political list. The flood may have provided the boundary between mythic and historical time. The result would be exactly what we possess: a document that is partly political propaganda, partly sacred mathematics, partly inherited mythology, and partly distorted history. That does not weaken the tablet. It makes it more valuable. The list is not merely trying to tell us who ruled. It is telling us how ancient Mesopotamia imagined the relationship between heaven, time, authority, and human decline. The first solution tells us the kings were mythologized. The second tells us the numbers were encoded. The third tells us the myth may preserve a memory. All three can be true. Alulai may not have been a human body surviving 800 years. His reign may still preserve the memory of an ancient order far older than the scribes who wrote his name. The values may still encode a system that later readers no longer understood. The flood may still represent a real era of catastrophe transformed into sacred history. The decline may still reflect the growing instability of post-flood civilization. The difficulty is that every explanation leaves one detail behind. If the kings are purely mythical, why does the list include historically attested rulers in the same sequence? If the numbers are symbolic, why are they summed so carefully? If the list is political propaganda, why preserve strange traditions that risk making the chronology unbelievable? If the reigns are astronomical, why attach them to cities and kings? If they represent dynasties, why are the dynasties so impossibly long? If the flood is only theological, why does it function as a chronological boundary across multiple traditions? If the story preserves biological decline, where is the physical evidence? The mystery survives because the tablet refuses to belong completely to one category. It is too historical to dismiss as pure fantasy, too mythological to use as straightforward chronology, too mathematical to call random exaggeration, too symbolic to read like a modern administrative record. It stands at the boundary. That may be exactly where it was intended to stand. The Sumerian king list begins where history cannot reach. It then travels toward history. It carries the reader from a world measured in tens of thousands of years into a world measured in decades. It does not explain the transition because the transition is the message. Humanity has moved from one condition into another. The first world is inaccessible. The second is the world of the scribes. The third is ours. and ours is shorter still. Not necessarily because our bodies live fewer years than those of ancient Mesopotamians. In many places, modern medicine has extended life expectancy, but our relationship with time has become more fragmented. We remember through devices. We replace institutions rapidly. We consume information and forget it. Empires rise and fall faster than the reigns of the earliest kings. The long continuity represented by the tablet feels more impossible now than ever. Perhaps the collapse did not end in ancient Mesopotamia. Perhaps it continued, not as a biological decline, but as the shortening of attention, memory, and civilization itself. The earliest king represents tens of thousands of years. A modern government plans for an election cycle. A company plans for a quarter. An individual plans for the next notification. Human life may be longer by certain measurements, but human time may be smaller. This leads to the final question. Why did the old scale never return? Why, after the flood, does the king list move only in one direction? Why do the numbers not rise again? Why does no later king recover 30,000 years? Why does no sage restore the complete knowledge? Why does Gilgamesh lose the plant? Why does the flood survivor remain distant from humanity? The answer may reveal what the collapse actually meant. Chapter 14. Why did the collapse never reverse? After the flood, kingship returns. That should have restored everything. If kingship descended from heaven once, it could descend with the same power again. If the gods could establish rulers with reigns lasting tens of thousands of years, they could repeat the act. If the first world was destroyed accidentally, the second world could have been rebuilt in its image. But that does not happen. The institution returns. The scale does not. This suggests the reduction was not temporary. The post-flood world was designed, remembered, or interpreted as a new condition, a condition with limits. The first reason the collapse never reversed may be environmental. A destroyed ecological system does not recover simply because water disappears. Soil may become saline. Rivers may change course. Species may vanish. Climate patterns may shift. Disease can become established in new populations. The infrastructure supporting stable life may be impossible to reconstruct. Survivors may preserve enough knowledge to begin again, but not enough to restore the old system completely. Each generation builds from fragments. The result is civilization, but not the same civilization. Kingship returns because political organization is necessary. Extreme continuity does not return because the conditions supporting it are gone. The second reason may be biological and demographic. Once short lifespan, infant mortality, and reproductive limits become normal, society reorganizes around them. Inheritance assumes rulers will die. Families assume generations will replace one another. Political systems depend on succession. Religions create rituals for death. Economies depend on transfer of property. Human identity becomes structured around a limited life. Even if greater longevity later became possible, the entire social order would need to change. A king who ruled for centuries would destabilize succession. A small group with extended life would accumulate overwhelming wealth and power. A population that stopped dying while continuing to reproduce would create immediate pressure on resources. Long life is not only a medical achievement, it is a political revolution. The Atrocist tradition understands this intuitively. Population and longevity cannot be separated. If humans multiply without limit and live for enormous periods, the system becomes unsustainable. Mortality solves the problem, not gently, not fairly, but effectively. The third reason may be theological. The flood marks a permanent separation between humans and gods. Before the catastrophe, boundaries are unstable. Divine beings interact directly. Sages transmit knowledge. Kingship descends. Extraordinary rulers appear. After the flood, the divine realm becomes more distant. Communication continues through temples, rituals, dreams, and selected specialists. But ordinary humanity no longer lives close to the source. The flood survivor is removed to a distant place. The plant of youth is lost. The gods remain immortal. Humans remain mortal. The separation becomes part of cosmic order. In this model, the collapse cannot reverse because reversal would erase the distinction between human and divine. Mortality defines humanity. The gods are the beings who do not die. Humans are the beings who know they will. Gilgamesh's failure is therefore necessary. If he succeeds, the central distinction collapses. A human king becomes equal to the gods. The story cannot allow it. He may become wise. He may build walls. He may leave a name, but he cannot carry his body beyond the appointed limit. The fourth reason may be intellectual. The knowledge needed to restore the old condition was lost. Not completely. Fragments survive. The plant, the flood survivor, the Apkallu traditions, the sacred measurements, the medical texts, the astronomical tables, but no single later figure possesses the whole system. Knowledge becomes specialized. One priest understands ritual. One scribe understands numbers. One healer understands herbs. One builder understands foundations. The integrated wisdom of the first sages is divided across institutions. When those institutions compete or collapse, the fragments separate further. Eventually, the procedures remain without their principles. Humanity remembers that the ancestors knew more. It does not remember how to reproduce what they knew. This is perhaps the most realistic form of lost knowledge. People often imagine a lost civilization disappearing in one dramatic night. Its libraries burn. Its machines sink. Its survivors die. But knowledge can disappear even when every document survives. It disappears when the context needed to interpret the documents is gone. A tablet can preserve a number for 4,000 years. If no one knows what the number measured, the information is still lost. The king list may be an example. The reigns survive. The key may not. The fifth reason may be political. Later rulers benefited from the belief that the first age was unrecoverable. A king could claim legitimacy from the ancient past without allowing subjects to expect the conditions of that past. He could say kingship descended from heaven. He could connect himself to Ululim. But he did not have to rule for 800 years. The flood explained the difference. It protected the prestige of the first age while excusing the limitations of the present. The ancient kings were greater because the world itself was greater. Modern rulers could not be blamed for failing to match them. They lived after the catastrophe. The myth made decline inevitable. This is politically useful. It turns present weakness into cosmic destiny. A short reign is not evidence of poor rule. It is evidence that humanity lives in a diminished age. The sixth reason is that the collapse may not refer to lifespan at all. It may refer to memory. The first world operates through long memory. Its rulers, sages, and institutions preserve continuity across vast cycles. The flood breaks that continuity. Afterward, every generation remembers less. The numbers shrink because the distance humanity can hold in direct awareness shrinks. Eventually, history becomes a series of fragments. A clay prism. A broken tablet. A damaged king's name. A half-preserved line. The collapse never reverses because human memory remains external. We store the past outside ourselves. Clay, stone, paper, digital archives. Each technology allows memory to survive beyond one body. Each also creates a new vulnerability. Clay breaks. Libraries burn. Languages die. Files become unreadable. Servers fail. Institutions censor, neglect, or reinterpret. The long memory always depends on survival of the container. Perhaps this is why the image of clay is so central. Clay is humble. Wet earth shaped by a human hand. It can be broken easily. But when fired, intentionally, or in the destruction of a city, it can survive longer than empires. The scribes may not have known who would read their lists. They may not have imagined Oxford. They may not have imagined modern museums, photography, or digital translation. But they understood something fundamental. Bodies die. Cities fall. Kingship moves. Clay can remain. The king list may therefore be an attempt to resist the collapse. A short-lived civilization recording the memory of long-lived rulers. A mortal scribe preserving the names of almost immortal kings. A fragile human hand pressing signs into material that might outlive the entire language. The act of writing becomes defiance. Human beings cannot remain alive for 30,000 years, but a name might. Ululim's body, if there was ever a historical body behind the name, is gone. His city changed. His language ceased to be spoken. The political world that preserved his memory vanished. Yet the name remains. In that sense, the tablet achieved what Gilgamesh could not. It crossed death. Not by preserving the body, by preserving the pattern. Perhaps that was always the alternative offered to humans. The gods possess biological immortality. Humans possess cultural immortality. We die. What we build may continue. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk and sees its walls differently. He failed to secure eternal life. But the city stands. The story survives. His name travels farther into the future than his body ever could. The king list does the same. It tells us that kingship survived the flood. But perhaps the deeper truth is that writing survived mortality. The collapse of lifespan never reversed, because the solution was not to restore the body. It was to create memory outside the body. That may be why civilization, writing, and kingship are intertwined in the Sumerian imagination. A civilization is a machine for extending human presence beyond one life. A king dies, but the office continues. A scribe dies, but the tablet remains. A builder dies, but the wall stands. A generation dies, but the city remembers. The first kings may have possessed long life. The later humans developed long memory. And perhaps the list is not mourning the loss of immortality. Perhaps it is documenting the invention of its replacement. But there is still one final possibility. The possibility that the numbers were never intended to be solved. They may have been intended to change the reader's sense of scale, to make one human life feel brief, to make one kingdom feel temporary, to remind every ruler that kingship existed before him and would continue after him, to remind every civilization that it stands on the ruins of an earlier world, to remind every person that history is longer than memory. That may be the true revelation behind the collapse. The tablet does not merely ask how long the first kings lived. It asks how much of the past a short-lived species is capable of understanding. And it asks what happens when that species begins to mistake the limits of its memory for the limits of history. Return to the beginning. A clay prism. 4 sides. 8 columns. Names pressed into wet earth by a person who could not have known who would read them. Alulam. Alangar. Enmen Lu Ana. Enmen Gao Ana. Dumazid. Ensipadzid Ana. Enmen Dur Ana. Ubaratutu. 8 kings. 5 cities. 241,200 years. Then the flood swept over. That is the structure left behind. The question is what it preserves. Does it preserve literal history? Probably not in the modern sense. There is no evidence that ordinary human kings possessed bodies capable of surviving for 30,000 years. Does it preserve mythology? Certainly. The earliest rulers inhabit sacred time. Kingship descends from heaven. The flood divides creation into 2 ages. Does it preserve mathematics? Clearly. The reigns are structured around a sexagesimal system. The numbers are deliberate. Does it preserve political ideology? Yes. The list turns Mesopotamian kingship into one divinely authorized institution, moving through a sequence of cities. Does it preserve cultural memory? Almost certainly. The flood, the first cities, the ancient kings, and the transfer of authority belong to traditions older than the surviving prism. The list is not one thing. It is a convergence. History, propaganda, theology, mathematics, and memory compressed into clay. That may be why the mystery refuses to die. A simple fabrication would be easy to dismiss. A simple administrative record would be easy to interpret. The king list is neither. It is a document written by people living inside one civilization while looking backward toward another world, a world they believed had existed before the flood, a world with different rulers, different knowledge, different proximity to the gods, and a different relationship with time. The most important pattern is not the exact number assigned to Ululim. It is the direction. The numbers fall. The divine rulers disappear. The sages become human. Immortality becomes exceptional. Knowledge becomes fragmented. Kingship survives, but its holders weaken. The old world is not gradually improved. It is gradually forgotten. That may be the real meaning of the collapse. The first death was not the death of the body. It was the death of continuity. Before the flood, the king list imagines a world in which power and memory extend across enormous periods. After the flood, existence is divided into generations. Every person inherits only fragments. Every child must learn again. Every ruler begins after another ruler's death. Every institution becomes vulnerable to interruption. The body dies once. Memory can die repeatedly. A language dies when no one can read it. A medical system dies when its practitioners vanish. A calendar dies when no one understands the cycle it measures. A history dies when its symbols remain, but its meaning is lost. The Sumerian king lists may be the surviving shell of such a memory. We can read the names. We can calculate the reigns. We can identify the mathematical units. But we cannot fully recover the world in which those numbers made immediate sense. The key is missing. That is the distance the flood represents. Not simply water between two lands. Forgetfulness between two ages. Perhaps the kings were divine symbols. Perhaps they were dynasties. Perhaps they represented celestial cycles. Perhaps their enormous reigns were designed to express political legitimacy. Perhaps the story magnified the memory of an earlier society whose rulers and institutions appeared extraordinarily stable. Perhaps several of these explanations are true at once. But whatever the answer, the tablet's creators wanted the first age remembered. They could have begun with recent kings. They could have ignored the impossible past. They did not. They carried the names forward. They calculated the total. They placed the flood at the boundary. They told every later ruler that kingship had once belonged to a world much larger than his own. And now, thousands of years later, the message produces the same effect. One modern lifetime feels small beside 28,800 years. One empire feels temporary beside 241,200. One version of history feels incomplete beside a text that begins before ordinary chronology. Perhaps that was the intended lesson. No ruler is the beginning. No civilization is the first. No generation possesses the complete memory. Human beings live briefly and mistake the portion they can see for the whole. The clay corrects that illusion. It says there was something before. Whether that before was mythological, political, astronomical, or historical, it mattered enough to preserve. It also says something changed. The flood swept over. Time narrowed. The first kings disappeared. The old knowledge became distant. And human beings entered the world we recognize. A world in which kings die. A world in which wisdom must be written down. A world in which the search for long life becomes a defining human obsession. Gilgamesh searched for a survivor. Modern humanity searches inside genes. The ancient kings sought a plant beneath the water. Modern scientists search for cellular pathways. The language has changed. The fear has not. We know that the body will fail. We know that memory will weaken. We know that everyone we love exists inside a limit. That knowledge drives religion, medicine, art, architecture, and civilization itself. We build because we cannot remain. We write because we cannot remember forever. We teach because our knowledge must cross into bodies that will outlive us. We create names because anonymity feels like a second death. The first kings may have lived for 30,000 years. Or perhaps their names carried 30,000 years of history. Perhaps that is the distinction the modern reader is missing. An individual does not need to survive physically for 30,000 years if the system bearing his name remains continuous. A dynasty can become one king. A civilization can become one reign. A sacred age can become one number. In that sense, the king list may not be measuring bodies. It may be measuring memory. Alulaim ruled for as long as the world remembered Alulaim's order. When the order changed, another name began. The flood ended all of them because it ended the memory system connecting the first cities. Afterward, new kings emerged inside shorter cycles, shorter institutions, shorter political worlds. The numbers collapsed because continuity collapsed. That may be the closest answer available. Human lifespans did not necessarily fall from 30,000 years to 80. Humanity's relationship with time fell from mythic continuity to fragmented history. The tablet preserves that fall through reigns. It transforms loss into mathematics. It turns forgetting into chronology. And yet the prism survived. That is the final irony. The document describing the collapse of long memory became part of the long memory. A scribe pressed the signs. The clay dried. Cities rose and fell. Languages changed. Empires passed over the land. The tablet was buried. The people who understood it disappeared. Then it was recovered, read again, translated, debated. The memory was damaged, but not destroyed. Perhaps that is the real victory hidden beneath the story. The flood did not erase everything. The kings' bodies disappeared. Their names did not. The first cities became ruins. Their order can still be traced. The language ceased to be spoken. Its signs can still be read. Human life remained short. Human memory learned how to cross thousands of years. The Sumerians did not defeat death biologically. They defeated it materially, with clay. That is what remains in the museum. Not proof of immortal humans. Proof that mortal humans understood the danger of forgetting. They knew that a civilization could disappear. They knew that authority could move. They knew that catastrophe could divide time into before and after. They knew that the future might misunderstand the past. And still, they wrote. They trusted the tablet to carry something forward, even if the complete explanation did not survive. So what does the Sumerian king list truly claim? It claims that kingship came from heaven. It claims 8 rulers governed before the flood. It assigns them reigns of impossible length. It claims the flood ended their world, and it records a dramatic contraction afterward. Everything beyond that is interpretation. But interpretation is where the mystery lives. Perhaps the early kings were gods. Perhaps they were dynasties. Perhaps they were cycles. Perhaps the numbers described a world in which time itself was understood differently. Perhaps the flood was local. Perhaps it compressed memories of several catastrophes. Perhaps it marked the loss of knowledge rather than the alteration of biology. Perhaps human beings never lived for 30,000 years. But the civilization that preserved the list believed the human story began on a scale far greater than the one visible around them. They believed their world was not the original world. They believed something had been lost, and they believed the loss began with the flood. That belief shaped the oldest surviving questions about mortality. Why do humans die? Why do gods possess life? Why can youth be renewed but not retained? Why does knowledge decline? Why does every civilization remember an earlier age of greater beings? The tablet does not answer those questions directly. It gives us the shape of the loss. 30,000 years. Then the flood. Then 1200. Then hundreds. Then decades. A narrowing corridor of time. At one end stand the kings who should not have existed. At the other stands the person reading their names today. Between them lies the entire history of human forgetting. And perhaps the final question is not whether Ululim's body survived for 28,800 years. Perhaps the final question is whether any part of us can survive that long. The Sumerians answered with clay. The king dies. The city falls. The water comes. But the name remains. And after nearly 4,000 years beneath the weight of history, the tablet is still speaking. The only question is whether we still understand what it is trying to say. If investigations like this matter to you, subscribe and turn on notifications. In the next video, we will examine the Sumerian accounts of the 7 sages who appeared before the flood, the knowledge they gave humanity, and why later traditions claimed that none of their original wisdom survived intact. The first kings carried impossible time. The first sages carried impossible knowledge. And according to the surviving traditions, both disappeared at exactly the same boundary. When the flood swept over,